Sherwood Forest was deathly silent, save for the soft rustling of leaves in the evening breeze. The nobleman sat upright in his lavishly adorned carriage, draped in silks and gold-trimmed fabrics, a stark contrast to the darkness swallowing the forest. His guards rode on either side, eyes darting into the thickening mist, hands gripping their swords tightly. Then, without warning, the first arrow struck. A chilling whistle sliced through the air before the impact, straight into the throat of the first guard. A gurgling gasp escaped his lips as he slumped off his horse, blood pooling beneath him. The second guard barely had time to turn before an arrow punctured his eye, the force sending him backward into the dirt. A third guard, trembling, reached for his sword, but an arrow buried itself deep into his chest, pinning him to the carriage's wooden side. The nobleman gasped, his heart hammering in terror. He shoved the carriage door open, scrambling out in an attempt to flee, but he didn't get far. From the shadows of the forest, figures emerged, silent, cloaked in darkness, moving like specters. The nobleman screamed as strong hands grabbed him, yanking him deeper into the trees. Twigs snapped beneath his struggling feet, but the more he fought, the tighter the hands gripped. His voice echoed through the trees, but the forest swallowed the sound whole. Then, he saw him. A hooded figure stood before him, his presence like a phantom of death. The nobleman's breath hitched as he recognized the legend, the so-called hero of the poor, the man who stole from the rich and gave to the needy. Robin Hood. The nobleman gasped, his voice trembling. But there was no kindness in the eyes beneath the hood, only something cold, something merciless. Robin crouched beside the nobleman, his gloved fingers tracing the noble's trembling jaw. "You reek of privilege," he murmured, voice almost soothing. "Tell me, my lord, how much did you steal from the starving families in Nottingham?" The nobleman shook his head violently. "No, I have done nothing wrong. I pay my taxes, I serve the king." Robin's lips curled into a slow, chilling smile. "A king who feasts while the people rot. And yet, you lick his boots." The nobleman sobbed, falling to his knees. "Please, please, I beg you. Take my money. Just let me live." Robin sighed, tilting his head. But that would be unjust, wouldn't it?" He reached into his cloak, drawing a dagger. The silver blade gleamed in the moonlight. "We must balance the scales." The nobleman let out a strangled cry as Robin grabbed him by the hair, yanking his head back. Without hesitation, he plunged the dagger deep into the man's gut. A piercing scream echoed through the trees, only to be cut off as Robin twisted the blade. The nobleman's body convulsed, his mouth gaping like a fish out of water. Blood soaked his fine robes, dripping onto the forest floor like rain. Robin wrenched the dagger free, letting the noble slump lifelessly against the roots of an ancient oak. Then, with meticulous precision, he set the scene. He took the noble's coin pouch, scattering the gold pieces over the ground. He tore the man's clothes, dragging the body a few feet to make it appear as if a desperate bandit had attacked. Satisfied, he stepped back, his face calm as if he had merely rearranged furniture. The other cloaked figures, his so-called merry men, watched in silence, their eyes empty. Robin wiped the blade clean on his cloak. "Come," he said softly, "we have work to do." The next morning, the sheriff of Nottingham rode into Sherwood Forest, his horse's hooves crunching over the fallen leaves. He dismounted near the noble's corpse, eyes scanning the grisly scene. His men examined the bodies, whispering amongst themselves. "Bandits, my lord?" one of the guards asked hesitantly. The sheriff knelt, his fingers grazing the noble's bloodied clothes. He studied the precision of the wounds, the positioning of the bodies, the way the robbery was staged. "No," he murmured, his expression darkening. He stood, his gaze sweeping the trees, as if expecting the shadows to answer. This wasn't just a robbery. The villagers' cheers echoed through the small village, their voices raw with gratitude. But Robin's smile remained calculated, his eyes scanning the crowd like a shepherd surveying his flock. Gold and food were handed out, filling empty hands and hollow bellies, yet something about the moment felt rehearsed. Maid Marian stood at the edge of the commotion, watching. She had always admired Robin, his courage, his defiance of corrupt nobility, but tonight, an unease crept into her thoughts. It was in the way he held himself, basking in the adoration, his fingers flexing at his sides as if gripping an invisible weapon. A small girl, no older than 6, tugged at his cloak. "Thank you, sir," she whispered, her voice barely above a breath. Robin knelt, resting a hand atop her head. "Grow strong, little one," he said gently. But as he straightened, Marian caught a flicker of something in his expression, something dark. A second later, it was gone. Little John clapped Robin on the back. "That's another victory, eh?" His deep laugh carried through the night. Well, Scarlet added, flipping a gold coin between his fingers. "And another noble bastard wiped from existence." Marian stiffened. Her gaze darted between them. The villagers saw Robin Hood as a hero, but his men, his closest allies, spoke as though they were soldiers in a hidden war. And their enemy wasn't just corruption. It was something else, something more personal. Robin turned, his sharp eyes meeting Marian's. For a brief moment, the world around them faded, the laughter, the music, the praise of the villagers. Only the two of them remained, locked in an unspoken battle. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a request. Marian hesitated, then followed. They moved away from the village, toward the outskirts where the firelight barely reached. The woods loomed ahead, dark and whispering. "Something troubles you," Robin said, his voice even. Marian stopped, folding her arms. "I saw the nobleman's body today." Robin tilted his head, feigning innocence. "And you killed him." Silence. Then, a slow smile spread across Robin's lips. "He was a thief, a parasite, just like the others." Marian's heart pounded. "But you didn't just rob him, Robin. You butchered him." Robin stepped closer, shadows licking at his face. "And what would you have me do, Marian? Let them keep bleeding this land dry? Watch as they take and take while the poor suffer." His voice was calm, measured, too controlled. She swallowed. "Justice is not the same as murder." Robin exhaled softly, reaching up to brush a strand of hair from her face. His fingers were warm, steady, but Marian felt no comfort, only a chill. "Justice," he murmured, "is what I make it." A rustling in the trees made them both turn. From the darkness, a figure stepped forward, a scout, one of Robin's men. He was panting, eyes wide with fear. "My lord," he gasped, "the sheriff is coming, and he's not alone." Robin's smile vanished. The hunt had begun. The torches in Nottingham Castle flickered violently as the Sheriff of Nottingham stormed into the war room, his cloak billowing behind him. His face, twisted with barely restrained fury, was cast in deep shadows by the dim candlelight. The long wooden table in the center of the room was covered with maps, blood-stained reports, and crude sketches of a hooded man. Robin Hood. Slamming his gauntlet fist onto the table, the sheriff's voice boomed through the chamber. "Another nobleman dead. Another body left to rot in the woods. And still, we have no damn proof." His deputies, a group of hardened men with wary expressions, exchanged nervous glances. "My lord," one of them began cautiously, "the people claim it was merely another robbery." "The villagers say Robin Hood would never." "Spare me their foolish praise," the sheriff snapped, his eyes burning with frustration. "That man, no, that monster, has fooled them all. He parades through their hovels like some saint, but I see the truth." He gritted his teeth. "He is no savior. He is a wolf in sheep's clothing." The room fell into a tense silence. One of the sheriff's more seasoned officers, Sir Baldwin, cleared his throat. "Then we must prove it, my lord. We must catch him in the act." The sheriff exhaled sharply, dragging a hand through his graying hair. He was tired. Weeks, months, of investigation had yielded nothing but bodies. Bodies of the rich, yes, but bodies nonetheless. And each time, Robin Hood's name was whispered in reverence, never an accusation. No witnesses, no evidence, just death. He turned to a young scribe seated in the corner. "Write this down." The scribe fumbled with his quill as the sheriff spoke. From this night forward, Robin Hood is not just a criminal. He is a murderer, and I will see his head mounted on the castle walls." The deputies stiffened. Declaring war against Robin Hood was dangerous. The people loved him. If they were to strike, it had to be decisive, without question or hesitation. Sir Baldwin frowned. "How do you intend to capture him, my lord? The forests are his domain. He knows them better than any of us." The sheriff smirked, a slow, knowing grin. "Then we shall make the forest his grave." He turned to another deputy. "Send word to Lord Gisborne. Tell him to bring his best hunters." His fingers tightened into a fist. "Robin Hood has evaded me long enough. The next time he kills, I will be waiting." His eyes flickered toward the window, where the vast, dark outline of Sherwood Forest loomed in the distance. Somewhere in those cursed woods, Robin Hood was watching, waiting, hunting, and this time, the sheriff would hunt him back. The forest was silent, save for the rhythmic scrape of metal against stone. Robin Hood sat alone beneath an ancient oak, his back pressed against its gnarled trunk. The moon hung high, its pale light barely piercing the dense canopy of Sherwood. In his hands, an arrow spun lazily between his fingers before he brought the tip to his whetstone. Shhhgay, shhhgay. The edge gleamed sharper with each stroke. His breath came slow, measured, controlled. But his mind was drowning. A flicker of memory surfaced, unbidden. A boy, himself, curled in a dark chamber, his small hands bound with rough rope. The smell of damp stone and rotting straw choked the air. From beyond the iron bars, laughter rang out, cruel, mocking. Then footsteps, heavy boots against the cold ground. Robin's heart pounded. The nobleman loomed over him, his silk robes brushing against the filth-covered floor. His jeweled fingers curled around a riding crop, its end still wet with fresh blood. Robin, no more than 10, did not cry. He had learned that lesson early. The noble crouched, tilting the boy's chin up with the leather tip. "Your father thought he could steal from me," he mused, voice rich with amusement. "And now, well, he rots in the mud." Robin's stomach twisted, but he did not look away. The noble's smile widened. "Do you know what I do to thieves?" The crack of the crop came before the pain. Robin flinched back to the present, his grip on the arrow tightening until his knuckles turned white. The past was never far. He exhaled, slow and steady, before rising to his feet. The trees stretched around him, their long fingers clawing at the sky. The forest had been his sanctuary for years, a kingdom of shadows where he was both ruler and reaper. Tonight, he would feed it once more. Robin moved like a ghost through the underbrush, silent as the wind. Ahead, a small campfire flickered. Seated beside it, sipping from a silver goblet, was Lord Edmund, a nobleman with a reputation for cruelty. He had overseen executions, burned villages, robbed the poor to fatten his own coffers. He was no different from the others. Robin watched from the darkness, his pulse steady. The noble chuckled at some unheard joke, his bodyguard standing a few feet away, eyes heavy with sleep. Robin pulled an arrow from his quiver, knocking it in a single fluid motion. The fletching brushed his cheek as he took aim. One shot. The arrow flew, piercing the bodyguard's throat before he could even gasp. The man crumpled to the ground, blood pooling beneath him. Lord Edmund lurched to his feet, wine sloshing from his goblet. His eyes darted wildly, searching for the unseen threat. "Who's there?" he barked, his voice laced with panic. Robin stepped into the firelight. The noble froze. "Why you?" Lord Edmund stammered, stumbling backward. "You're Robin Hood." Robin tilted his head, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "So they say." The noble's hands shook. I have gold. I can pay you." Robin sighed, taking another step forward. "Gold," he mused, rolling the word on his tongue. "You think this is about gold?" Lord Edmund opened his mouth to reply, to beg, but Robin's blade was faster. The knife slid clean across the noble's throat, parting flesh like parchment. Blood sprayed, staining Robin's hands, the ground, the fire's glow. The nobleman fell, gasping, eyes wide with shock. Robin crouched beside him, watching as the light drained from his gaze. "This," he whispered, "is justice." Then, as always, he went to work. Within minutes, the scene was transformed. The bodyguard's blade was placed into Lord Edmund's lifeless hand. The cuts upon his body altered to tell a different tale. A struggle, a betrayal, a fight among thieves. By morning, the sheriff would hear of a noble murdered by his own man, and Robin Hood would remain nothing more than a legend. A hero, a savior, and no one would ever see the wolf beneath the hood. The village was alive with the scent of freshly baked bread and the laughter of children darting between makeshift homes. It was a place of hardship, but today there was joy, a rare thing in Nottingham. A shipment of gold and supplies had mysteriously arrived the night before, and everyone knew who to thank. "Robin Hood," an old woman crooned, pressing a wrinkled hand to her heart. "Bless him. Without him, we'd be nothing but bones in the dirt." Maid Marian smiled warmly, listening as the villagers recounted tales of their hooded savior. She had heard them before. How he robbed from the rich, how he stood against tyranny, how he was the only thing standing between them and starvation. And yet, as she walked through the dirt paths, something gnawed at her. Robin was a hero, but he was also a mystery. She had met him before, spoken with him at court when he was still Robert of Locksley, a nobleman's son, arrogant but charming. But when his family fell, so did his name. And now? Now he was something else entirely. "Lady Marian," a voice called. She turned to see a group of villagers gathered near a worn-out wooden table, and at its head, relaxed, smiling, as if he hadn't a care in the world, was Robin Hood himself. Marian felt her breath catch. Even cloaked in simple leather and cloth, he had a presence that was impossible to ignore. His emerald green eyes shone with mischief, and his signature smirk was firmly in place as he rolled a dagger between his fingers. "Robin," she greeted, stepping forward. His gaze flickered up, and for a brief moment, something unreadable passed through his expression. Then, he grinned. "Lady Marian." He rose from his seat with the ease of a man who feared nothing. "What brings Nottingham's fairest flower to our humble corner of the world?" Marian chuckled, shaking her head. "Your charm is as sharp as ever. And yet, your heart remains untouched," he mused, placing a hand over his chest in mock sorrow. "Perhaps one day I shall steal it, just as I do with the sheriff's gold." The villagers erupted into laughter, eating up his every word. Marian played along, smiling, but deep inside, something about him unsettled her. She had known men like him before, witty, confident, impossible to pin down. But there was something else in Robin, something darker. She watched as he interacted with the people, noting how effortlessly he wove between kindness and control. He was their savior, yes, but there was an intensity in the way they looked at him, like they needed him, like they feared losing him. And in his eyes, for the briefest second, she saw something cold, something calculating. "Marian?" Robin's voice pulled her from her thoughts. She blinked, realizing he was watching her. "Forgive me," she said quickly. "I was simply wondering how you do it. How you remain so fearless, despite everything." Robin tilted his head, his smirk never wavering. But there was something in his gaze now, a flicker of amusement, or perhaps something else. "A man with nothing to lose," he murmured, "is a man who fears nothing at all." Marian's stomach tightened. There was an edge to his voice, a quiet finality that sent a shiver down her spine. For the first time, she wondered, truly wondered, if there was more to Robin Hood than the legend, and if she had been blind to something far more dangerous all along. The air in Sherwood Forest was thick with the scent of pine and damp earth, the ground soft beneath Tom's small feet as he ran along the familiar paths. He was no older than 12, with wild brown hair that fell in messy curls over his forehead, his clothes patched from days of running through the woods and helping his mother with chores. He had always loved the forest, its shadows, its quiet, its freedom. It was a place where he could escape the reality of village life, the hunger and the hardships. But today, the forest was different. Today, it was alive with a strange energy. Tom had been playing near the edge of the woods, near the hill where the trees grew thick and dark. He had made a game of finding the perfect stick to use as a sword when he heard the unmistakable sound of hooves. Slow, steady. He froze. The sound grew closer, and from behind a cluster of bushes, Tom saw a nobleman's carriage pass through the clearing. The vehicle was lavish, gold filigree glittering in the weak sunlight, its guards riding beside it like silent statues. Tom knew this nobleman, Lord Aldred, one of the richest men in Nottingham, who had been known to take what he wanted, no matter the cost. Tom felt a knot in his stomach. Something wasn't right. He crept lower, crouching behind the brush as the carriage passed. Then, his heart skipped a beat. A figure stepped out from the shadows, cloaked in green, with a hood pulled low over his face. Robin Hood. Tom knew him from the tales the villagers told. The man who robbed the rich to feed the poor. The man who was always just out of reach, like a fleeting shadow. But what he saw next, it wasn't what he had expected. Robin stepped into the clearing, his bow drawn, his movements smooth and practiced. Before Tom could even blink, an arrow flew from the bow, striking one of the guards in the chest with sickening precision. The guard fell, his scream muffled by the suddenness of it. Tom's breath caught in his throat. He knew he should run, should flee before he was noticed, but his legs refused to move. He was rooted to the spot, eyes wide with fear. The nobleman scrambled from the carriage, shouting for his men to protect him. But Robin was faster, his blade flashing in the sunlight as he slashed through the air. Tom winced, hearing the wet thud of steel against flesh, the scream that followed. The nobleman fell to his knees, clutching at the wound in his side, but it was no use. Robin stepped forward, his face hidden beneath the hood, his eyes cold and focused. "Please, please don't kill me," the nobleman begged, his voice cracking with terror. "I'll give you anything. Gold land. What do you want?" Robin paused, his grip tightening around the hilt of his blade. His voice was low, barely a whisper. "What I want is simple. Justice." With one swift movement, Robin ended the nobleman's life, his body crumpling to the ground like a rag doll. Tom's heart pounded in his chest, the blood rushing in his ears. He had seen death before, but never like this, never so cold. Robin didn't look at the body. Instead, he crouched beside the nobleman's lifeless form, pulling out a small pouch of gold from his robes and slipping it into his own pocket. Then, with a swift motion, he staged the scene. The nobleman's body was positioned, the dagger placed in his hand, his fingers curling around the hilt as though he had been the one to kill. It looked like a robbery gone wrong, an argument turned deadly. Robin made sure everything was in place, then stepped back into the shadows, disappearing as silently as he had come. Tom sat in the bushes, shaking. He couldn't breathe. His heart thundered in his chest, and his legs felt weak. The scene played in his mind over and over again, a blur of blood and shadows, the coldness of Robin Hood's eyes as he killed. Robin wasn't just a hero. He was a killer. Tom waited until the sounds of the carriage had long faded away before he dared to move. His body trembled as he stood, his knees threatening to buckle beneath him. He couldn't stay in the forest any longer. Not now. With a glance over his shoulder, Tom sprinted back toward the village, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He had to tell someone. He had to warn them. But as the village came into view, a new fear took hold of him. What if no one believed him? What if they called him crazy? What if they thought he was the one who had killed the nobleman? Tom's steps slowed as he reached the village's edge, his thoughts racing. He didn't know what to do. The faces of the villagers, those who praised Robin, those who called him their savior, came to him. How could he tell them the truth? How could he expose the man they adored? He felt a hand on his shoulder. He spun around, his heart leaping into his throat, but it was only his mother, her expression concerned. "Tom, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." He swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath, but the words wouldn't come. The image of Robin's cold eyes lingered in his mind. "Nothing, Ma," he finally whispered. "Nothing at all." But deep inside, Tom knew. He had seen too much. The fire crackled in the center of the clearing, casting long, dancing shadows against the trees surrounding Robin and his merry men. The night was cool, and a faint mist curled up from the ground, clinging to the earth like a whisper. The men sat in a loose circle around the flames, their faces partially illuminated by the flickering light, their voices hushed but eager. Robin Hood stood at the center, his posture relaxed but commanding, his cloak flowing behind him like the wind itself. His eyes gleamed, their intensity betraying a mind always working, always plotting. His merry men, Little John, Will Scarlet, Much the miller's son, and the others, watched him with admiration, their loyalty unshakable. "Tonight, we strike again," Robin's voice cut through the quiet night, his words filled with conviction. "The rich, the powerful, they think they can hoard everything. But we will take it from them, not because we need it, but because they don't deserve it." The men nodded in agreement, murmurs of approval rising like a chorus. "Justice," Robin continued, "is what they fear. It's what makes them tremble. And it is why we do what we do. Not for ourselves, but for them. The poor, the suffering, the voiceless." He paused for effect, letting his words sink in. The fire crackled, the only sound besides the rustling of the trees. Little John, ever the giant of a man, leaned forward, his brow furrowed in concern. "But Robin, we've killed before. Real people, nobles, guards. The blood we've shed, it's not just robbery anymore. It's murder." Will Scarlet, sitting across from Little John, nodded. "John's right. These men, these women we've taken from, they have families. They have lives." Robin's gaze hardened, his expression darkening just enough to send a chill through the air. "And what of the families we've saved, Will? What of the lives we've given back to the poor? The ones who were starved, oppressed, crushed beneath the boot of those very nobles you're so eager to defend." The fire's glow reflected off his face, casting his features in sharp relief, making his eyes glint with a dangerous fire of their own. "They do not deserve mercy. They never have." His voice dropped lower, almost a growl. "And if we do not take what is theirs, they will take everything from us. You know this to be true." Little John shifted uncomfortably, but the men around him didn't hesitate. They had seen the desperation in Robin's eyes, the fire that burned within him. They had followed him into battle time and time again, believing in the cause, believing in the man they had come to see as something more than just a leader. "He speaks the truth, John," Will said, his voice firm but filled with an edge of doubt. "We're not murderers, we're avengers. Every strike we make is a blow for justice, for the people. We do this for them, not for ourselves." Much the miller's son, who had been silent until now, finally spoke up, his voice shaky but resolute. We've all seen what the rich do to us. We've seen it with our own eyes. What's one more dead noble compared to the suffering they've caused?" Robin smiled, the kind of smile that held no warmth but instead a promise of something darker. "Exactly much," he said softly, his tone coaxing. "One more dead noble, and we get one step closer to the world we want. A world where the strong do not prey on the weak, where justice reigns and those who've stolen from us are made to answer." The men looked at one another, unsure but drawn in by Robin's persuasive charisma. He had always been good with words, able to twist them like threads and weave them into a tapestry of righteousness and vengeance. Robin's gaze swept over the group, his eyes locking with each of his merry men in turn. He could see the doubt flickering in their eyes, but it was fading, slowly replaced by the belief he had carefully nurtured. "They'll call us murderers, thieves, outlaws," he continued, his voice rising now, filled with purpose. "But what is the world if not a place where the just are punished and the corrupt reign? We are the ones who stand between the people and those who would see them crushed underfoot. We are justice. And tonight, we will take another step toward making the world right." The fire flared, lighting his face in harsh, fiery relief. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Little John slowly stood, his shoulders broad and imposing, but his expression softened. He muttered, "I understand." One by one, the other men stood, nodding, some with uncertainty still in their eyes, but all united in their loyalty to Robin. They would follow him, wherever he led, however dark the path. Robin smiled again, this time with a flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. Good. Let's remind them why they fear us. As the group dispersed, the air hung heavy with the weight of Robin's words. They were not just outlaws. They were avengers, and they would stop at nothing to see their vision of justice realized. Robin Hood, once a nobleman, now a hero to the people, stood in the center of it all. His heart colder than the steel of his bow, his purpose sharper than the arrow he drew. The men trusted him, believed in him, but behind his words was a deeper, darker drive. One that, if left unchecked, might lead them all down a path from which there would be no return. And so, with every whisper of the wind through the trees, a new question arose. Just how far would Robin Hood go in his pursuit of justice, and how many would fall before him before the line between hero and villain disappeared altogether? Tom had always been the quiet one. He spent his days playing near the forest, lost in his thoughts, a boy of few words but a curious nature. But the events of the past week had twisted something deep inside him. What he had seen that night in the woods, the murder, the blood, Robin Hood's cold eyes, was etched in his mind like a nightmare that wouldn't fade. He couldn't erase the image of the nobleman's pleading face, the life draining from his eyes as Robin had struck him down without a second thought. That night, after the raid had ended and the village had returned to its usual quiet, Tom sat at the edge of his bed, staring into the dim light of the flickering candle. His heart raced with the weight of the secret he carried. He knew he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. The truth had to come out. But who would believe him? And more importantly, who would help him? His older sister, Emily, was the one person he trusted. She had always been there for him, protecting him from the harshness of the world. She had a fierce spirit, but even she wasn't immune to the fear that Robin Hood inspired. Tom's eyes were wide with panic when he found her in the small cottage they called home, sitting by the fire. "Emily," Tom whispered, his voice shaking. I saw Robin Hood. He killed someone. A nobleman. It wasn't a robbery, like they say. It was cold. He killed him in cold blood." Emily's eyes widened, and her face paled. She stood up, her hand gripping his shoulder tightly as if she could steady him just by her touch. "Tom, hush," she said in a low, urgent whisper. "You mustn't speak of this to anyone. Do you hear me? Not a soul." "But he's not who they say he is, Emily. He's a killer. I saw it with my own eyes. Quiet," Emily hissed, her eyes darting nervously to the door. The shadows in the room seemed to close in on them as she leaned in, her voice barely above a breath. "You think anyone will believe you? No one will. Robin Hood is a hero to the people. They'll never accept what you've seen. And if Robin finds out you told, if he hears even a whisper of this, Tom, you'll be next." Tom shuddered, his mind racing. He had never seen his sister so fearful before, and it only made his dread grow. But Emily, what if someone needs to know the truth? What if he's just hurting people, like he hurt that man? She pulled him close, her hands trembling as she held him tightly. "Listen to me, Tom. You stay silent. No one can know, not even your closest friends. If you say a word, it could mean death. Death, do you understand?" Tom nodded reluctantly, but the fear gnawed at his insides. How could he live with such a secret? How could he stand by and let Robin Hood, the so-called hero, continue to kill without anyone ever knowing? He felt trapped, suffocated by the weight of his knowledge. Meanwhile, in the woods, Robin Hood was not as blind as the others thought. His sharp eyes caught every small detail, every movement, every glance. And tonight, something was off. He had noticed Tom earlier in the village. His nervousness, the way his eyes kept darting around, his fidgeting hands as if he couldn't keep still. There was something strange in the boy's demeanor, something that didn't quite add up. Robin had been watching him from a distance, careful to keep out of sight. Tom had seen too much. Robin's instincts told him that the boy knew something that could unravel everything he had worked for. As the shadows deepened, Robin silently moved through the trees, staying just out of view, but close enough to keep his gaze fixed on Tom. He could see the boy talking to someone, his older sister, judging by the way they huddled together in whispers. Robin narrowed his eyes. They were conspiring. The weight of the boy's knowledge settled like a stone in Robin's gut. The boy had seen him kill, and if anyone found out, if anyone spoke of it, Robin's carefully crafted image of the people's hero would shatter. It was time to act, but how? Would Tom stay silent, as his sister urged him to? Or would the truth finally break free? The wind rustled through the trees as Robin stood motionless, his expression unreadable but his thoughts racing. The firelight flickered in the distance, but his focus never wavered from the boy. And then, as if sensing his gaze, Tom's eyes suddenly flicked up, meeting Robin's from across the clearing. It was just a moment, but it was enough. Robin's heart skipped a beat, his grip tightening around the hilt of his bow. Tom froze, and for a brief second, they stared at each other. The boy's face was pale, his eyes wide with fear. Robin didn't move. The silence between them stretched, thick and heavy. But Robin's gaze softened ever so slightly. Not with pity, but with a calculated calm. He knew the boy's secret now, and he also knew the boy would never speak a word, if he valued his life. Tom's legs shook beneath him as he turned and hurried back into the cottage, his heart hammering in his chest. He had been seen. Robin Hood knew. As Robin turned away, disappearing into the shadows of Sherwood Forest, the unease in his chest grew. The boy was just a small piece of a much bigger puzzle, and Robin Hood was determined to make sure the pieces never fell into place. The game was only just beginning. The camera lingered on Tom's terrified face as he entered the cottage, the door creaking shut behind him. The cold, ominous silence settled once more over the village, and the forest seemed to whisper with dark promises of what was to come. Robin Hood's eyes never left the boy's form, the boy who had seen too much. And then, the scene cut to black. The question hung in the air like a suffocating fog. Would Tom live to see another day? Or would Robin Hood silence him before the truth could be revealed? The mystery deepened, and the stakes grew higher. The village was quieter than usual that morning, the air heavy with a sense of unease. The people moved about their daily routines, but there was an undercurrent of fear. Marian, who had long championed the cause of the poor, moved through the village with a practiced grace, handing out food and offering solace. She was admired, almost revered, for her kindness, yet today, her heart felt unsettled. The atmosphere was different, thick with murmurs about Robin Hood. As she passed a small gathering of women gossiping near the well, she overheard snippets of conversation that caught her attention. "You heard? Another one. Dead. They say Robin Hood did it. A noble, I think," one woman whispered, glancing nervously around as if the trees themselves might be listening. Another woman, older and weathered by years of hardship, nodded grimly. Robin's been talking more than gold. There's something dark in him. People are scared, but they're too afraid to speak up." Marian's brow furrowed. She had seen Robin's generosity, his quick wit, and his passion for helping the poor, but she had also seen moments of coldness, moments that unsettled her. She paused, listening to the whispers, her suspicions growing. Robin had always been a symbol of hope for the downtrodden, but the dark rumors swirling around him were beginning to chip away at the image she had built in her mind. Her thoughts drifted to the nobleman who had been killed. The stories she had heard in passing painted Robin as a hero, a man who robbed the rich to give to the poor. But could it be true? Was he truly what he appeared to be? Or was there a darker side to Robin Hood, one that no one spoke of? Determined to find answers, Marian made a decision. She would no longer simply follow the crowd and accept the tales of Robin as truth. She would uncover the man behind the legend. That evening, as the sun began to sink behind the trees, Marian decided to follow Robin into the forest. She had heard the familiar sounds of his merry men gathering, the rustling of the leaves underfoot, the murmurs of plans being made. She knew he often met with them after raids to strategize, and tonight, she was determined to learn more. Quiet as a shadow, Marian slipped into the forest, her senses heightened. She moved between the trees, staying hidden in the darkness, careful not to make a sound. Every few steps, she paused, her eyes scanning the area, looking for signs of movement. The forest was alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, but Marion's focus was entirely on the clearing ahead. There, illuminated by the dim light of a campfire, stood Robin Hood, surrounded by his merry men. The men spoke in low tones, their faces half hidden in the shadows, but Marion could see the sharpness in their eyes, the intensity of their words. She crept closer, pressing herself against the bark of an old oak tree, her breath shallow in her chest. Her heart pounded in her ears, but she didn't dare move. Robin's voice cut through the murmur of the camp. "Tomorrow night, we strike again. We'll hit the tax collector's convoy on the East Road. No mercy." His tone was calm, but there was an edge to it. Something cold, something calculating. Marion felt a shiver run down her spine as she listened, her pulse quickening. The words themselves weren't unusual. Robin had often raided tax collectors, taking from the rich to give to the poor. But there was something about the way he spoke that unsettled her. "No mercy?" one of the merry men asked, his voice laced with disbelief. "We're not just robbing them, are we?" Robin's response was simple, his voice like steel. "No mercy. They've been draining the people for far too long. Let them feel the cost of their greed." Marion's stomach twisted at the coldness of his words. She had always admired Robin's sense of justice, his desire to help those who were oppressed, but what she heard now was different. There was a hint of cruelty, a thirst for violence in his voice that she hadn't noticed before. Was this the same man she had stood by? The man who had inspired her and so many others? Her hand tightened around the tree as her mind raced. Could it be that Robin had a darker side? Had his quest for justice turned him into something else, something dangerous? As the meeting continued, Marion stepped back, slowly and quietly retreating into the darkness. She didn't want to be seen, didn't want Robin to know she had overheard. But her mind was reeling with the implications of what she had just witnessed. The Robin Hood she had admired, the hero who stood up for the poor, was beginning to feel like a stranger to her. And the more she thought about it, the more the seeds of doubt grew. Back in Nottingham, Sheriff Blackwood was no fool. The string of murders, noblemen left dead in the woods, the raids on the wealthy, all of it was starting to point in one direction. Robin Hood, the elusive bandit, once thought to be a hero, was beginning to look more like a serial killer. And Blackwood was determined to prove it. His investigations had hit dead ends time and time again, but he knew he couldn't let this slip through his fingers. The people may have believed in Robin, but Blackwood knew better. Robin Hood was dangerous, and if left unchecked, he could destroy everything Blackwood had worked to build. Inside the cold stone walls of Nottingham Castle, Blackwood gathered his deputies. The flickering torchlight cast long shadows across their faces as they sat in silence, awaiting his orders. "Robin Hood is no hero," Blackwood began, his voice low and steely. "We've had enough of this charade. Every time someone gets killed, they say it's just another robbery. But I know better. This isn't a thief taking from the rich. This is something much worse." One of the deputies, a young man named Thomas, raised an eyebrow. "You think it's him, Sheriff? Robin Hood?" Blackwood slammed his fist on the table, making the men jump. "Who else could it be? He's been seen at every raid. And I've got men telling me he's been more than just stealing. He's been killing." A murmur of disbelief ran through the group, but Blackwood silenced them with a wave of his hand. "I'm not just talking about the recent murders. There's something more going on here. Something we haven't connected yet." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "There's a pattern. Every 10 years, strange things happen in Sherwood Forest. People disappear. Bodies are found, but no one knows how they died. We're dealing with more than just a thief here. Robin Hood is hiding something." Blackwood turned his attention to the map on the table, tracing his finger over the landmarks. His mind was racing. The dots were starting to connect. He could feel it. This wasn't just about money or revenge. Robin Hood had a darker purpose, and Blackwood would be the one to expose it. Robin Hood was no stranger to manipulation. He had perfected the art long ago, using charm, charisma, and fear to control his merry men. But lately, his tactics had become more extreme. His desire for justice was morphing into something far more dangerous, and he was starting to use his power to manipulate those closest to him. One evening, Robin gathered his men in a secluded part of the forest, his eyes glinting with the promise of more violence. The tax collector's convoy was scheduled to pass through that night, and Robin had plans. "We'll raid them," he said, his voice sharp. "We'll make them regret every coin they've taken from us. We'll show them that their greed comes with a cost." Little John, who had always been loyal to Robin, hesitated. "We've been taking from them for years, Robin. But what if this time is different? What if we—" Robin silenced him with a cold look. "What if?" "There are no what-ifs, John. This is the only way to make them listen, to make them fear us." "Well," Scarlet spoke up, his voice shaky. "But, Robin, we're not just robbing them anymore, are we? We're killing them." Robin's eyes hardened. "If they die, so be it. It's their fault. They're the ones who've taken everything from us." The men exchanged uneasy glances, but none dared to challenge him. Robin had always been their leader, their hero, but something in his eyes, something dark, told them that they were no longer just following a man who fought for justice. They were following a killer. Marian had seen enough. She couldn't ignore what she had learned. The Robin Hood she had trusted, the man she had fought alongside, was slipping into something monstrous. She had to confront him, to demand answers. That night, under the cover of darkness, Marian approached Robin in the forest. Her heart raced as she made her way to the clearing where he and his men often met. She knew this confrontation could change everything. When she arrived, Robin was standing by the campfire, his back to her. He turned as he heard her approach, his face a mask of calm. "What's this, Marian?" Robin asked, his voice low but laced with curiosity. "I need answers," Marian said, her voice trembling but resolute. "What have you become, Robin? The man I admired, who fought for justice, he's gone. What are you doing?" Robin's eyes darkened. "I'm doing what needs." Marian had spent days combing through the woods, searching for anything that could explain the strange behavior she had witnessed in Robin. The more she thought about it, the more the unease gnawed at her. Robin's actions had become increasingly erratic, and she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to him than the man who had always stood for justice. Her heart heavy with suspicion, she wandered deeper into the forest, her instincts telling her to keep looking, to find something concrete that could answer her questions. As the sun dipped low behind the trees, Marian stumbled upon something unexpected, a hidden entrance to a cave, partially obscured by thick vines and overgrown foliage. The air felt heavy around it, as if the very earth had been disturbed. Her breath caught in her throat. This cave, with its strange aura, was unlike anything she had seen before. With cautious steps, Marian pushed aside the vines and ventured inside. The darkness inside was suffocating, but Marian's eyes quickly adjusted to the dim light filtering through small cracks in the stone. She crept further into the cave, her heart pounding in her chest. The eerie silence of the place only heightened her sense of dread. As she moved deeper, the shadows shifted around her, and she noticed something that made her blood run cold. A large stash of weapons stacked in the corner. She approached cautiously, her fingers brushing against the cold steel of knives, daggers, and swords. These were not the weapons of a band of rebels fighting for the common good. They were tools of murder, of someone with far darker intentions. Alongside the weapons, Marian spotted piles of stolen goods, rich fabrics, jewels, and bags of gold, all gleaming ominously in the low light. It was clear that Robin was not just robbing the rich for the sake of the poor. He was amassing power, accumulating wealth for reasons far more sinister than mere survival. But it wasn't just the weapons and stolen goods that sent a chill down her spine. There, lying at the edge of the pile, were blood-stained clothes, once fine garments, now soaked in crimson. Marian's stomach twisted as she knelt to examine them. The fabric was torn and stained, the blood still fresh and sticky to the touch. She couldn't help but run her fingers over the emblem embroidered on the chest of one of the shirts. It was a nobleman's insignia, the crest of a family she recognized. Her heart sank as the implications of this discovery hit her. Robin was involved in the murders. He wasn't just taking from the rich, he was killing them. The realization shook her to her core. The man she had believed to be a hero was no better than the very people he had sworn to fight against. Was this really the same Robin who had once stood by her side, who had promised to protect the weak? Before she could process the full extent of what she had uncovered, a sound broke the silence, the soft crunch of footsteps on the dirt floor of the cave. Marian's breath caught in her throat. Panic surged through her as she quickly ducked behind a pile of crates, holding her breath, praying she wouldn't be noticed. From her hiding spot, she saw Robin's tall figure appear in the entrance. His eyes scanned the cave, and his expression was unreadable, cold, distant, and calculating. Marian's heart pounded in her chest as she held herself perfectly still. She knew she had to get out, to warn someone, but she couldn't risk making a sound. Robin stepped closer to the stash of weapons, his hand brushing over the blades, and Marian's mind raced. He was hiding something, something far darker than she had ever imagined. What had she gotten herself into? Robin muttered to himself, his voice low and angry, but Marian couldn't make out the words. She couldn't stay here much longer. If he found her, it would be too late. Slowly, she inched backward, keeping her eyes on him as he continued to inspect the cave. Her mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but one question stood above them all. How could she stop him? How could she confront the man she had trusted without risking her life? Robin entered the village with his usual swagger, his merry men following closely behind, each carrying bags of gold and crates of food. As they walked through the narrow streets, the villagers greeted them with cheers and applause, grateful for the generosity that had helped keep them alive through the harsh winters. Robin smiled, accepting the praise, but his eyes scanned the crowd with the practiced air of a man who knew exactly how to work a crowd. He handed out coins and food with ease, his charm as effortless as the smile that spread across his face. The people adored him, seeing him as a savior who had come to deliver them from the oppressive rule of the wealthy. Yet, beneath the surface, there was a tension in the air, a murmur of unease that even the most loyal of villagers couldn't shake. The rumors of the recent murders hung over them like a dark cloud, but none dared to question Robin. He was their hero, the man who fought for their survival, and they believed in him, perhaps too deeply. As Robin continued to distribute his loot, a group of soldiers from the Sheriff of Nottingham arrived at the village, their armor clinking in the quiet street. They began questioning the villagers about the recent deaths of several noblemen, their eyes narrowing as they searched for answers. Some villagers cast nervous glances, but they stood firm. They denied any knowledge of the murders, swearing their allegiance to Robin. Their voices wavered, but none spoke ill of the man who had brought them hope, even in the darkest of times. Robin stood nearby, watching the exchange with interest, his posture relaxed, as if the questions didn't concern him. "Did you hear about the nobleman found dead in the woods?" one of the soldiers asked, his voice sharp and accusing. The villagers shook their heads, feigning ignorance. "We've seen nothing, sir," one elderly woman replied, clutching her children to her side. "We're just poor folk. Why would we harm anyone?" Robin watched the interaction with a small smile, his eyes glinting with satisfaction. He knew this game well. He had crafted his image as a hero so thoroughly that no one would believe a word against him. The sheriff's men left, still suspicious, but with no evidence to tie Robin to the murders. They couldn't touch him. Not yet. After the soldiers had gone, Robin made his way to Marian's cottage, his steps light but purposeful. He pushed open the door without knocking, a smile playing at the corners of his lips. Marian was sitting by the fire, her face shadowed with concern, but she quickly masked her emotions as he entered. "Ah, Marian," Robin said, his voice full of warmth. "I trust you've been well?" Marian didn't immediately respond. She had been expecting him, but the sight of him now stirred a storm of emotions within her. Suspicion, fear, and a strange sense of betrayal. She had been over the events in her mind 1,000 times since discovering the stash, and she couldn't shake the feeling that Robin was hiding something far darker than he let on. "Robin," she said coolly, forcing a smile, "you're as charming as ever. What brings you here today?" Robin's smile widened as he stepped closer, taking a seat beside her. He reached for her hand, his touch warm and familiar, but Marian quickly withdrew it, her gaze cold and distant. "Can't a man visit a lady without an ulterior motive?" Robin teased, his tone light, but with an underlying intensity that Marion couldn't ignore. He leaned in closer, his lips brushing against her ear as he whispered, "You know, I'm just here to see you, Marion. No one else." Her pulse quickened, but it wasn't from the same excitement she once felt when he was near. She felt the weight of his gaze, the way it seemed to see through her, as though he was reading her thoughts. She shifted uncomfortably, unwilling to show her growing unease. "I don't know, Robin," Marion said, her voice low. "I've been thinking a lot about what's been happening around here. About the murders." Robin's face faltered for just a moment before the smile returned. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping lightly on the armrest. "The sheriff and his men will never catch me. I've always been one step ahead of them." Marion's stomach twisted. She had been over the evidence in her mind 100 times, and yet she couldn't bring herself to confront him directly. Something about the way he said those words unsettled her. It was as if he was daring her to ask more, to question him, but she couldn't find the courage to push him further. "Well," Robin continued, his voice now more tender, "you should know, Marion, that nothing is as it seems. You don't need to worry about me." "I'm not worried, Robin," Marion replied, her tone colder than she intended. "I'm just thinking." "Thinking, eh?" Robin chuckled softly. "Well, you're a woman of mystery, Marion. That's why I like you." Marion's heart fluttered for a moment at his compliment, but it quickly died in her chest. She wanted to believe him. She wanted to believe that Robin was still the man she had once admired, the man who had fought for the innocent. But with every passing day, the truth became clearer, and the truth was far more disturbing than she could have imagined. The sheriff of Nottingham sat in his dimly lit office, surrounded by scrolls and maps. His brow was furrowed in concentration as he studied the details of the recent murders. The once comfortable space now felt oppressive, the thick scent of smoke from the fire mingling with the metallic tang of frustration. He traced his finger along the worn map, marking the locations of each murder. There was a pattern that was becoming impossible to ignore. All of the killings had occurred near Sherwood Forest, and more specifically, near the hideouts that Robin Hood and his merry men were known to frequent. The sheriff's mind raced as the pieces slowly clicked into place. Robin Hood, the so-called hero of the poor, was directly connected to these deaths. The more the sheriff thought about it, the clearer it became. Robin Hood was not the savior the villagers believed him to be. He was a ruthless killer, and the murders were not the result of random chance. They were carefully planned, with each death following a deliberate pattern. With a grim expression, the sheriff stood up and walked to the large window that overlooked Nottingham. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, his mind racing with a singular, burning thought. He had to catch Robin. He had to end this reign of terror before it consumed the entire kingdom. As he paced back and forth in his office, a loud knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. The sheriff turned quickly, his sharp eyes locking onto the figure standing in the doorway. It was one of his deputies, holding a prisoner by the arm. "Sir, we've captured a thief who was seen near one of the murder sites," the deputy said, his voice tinged with urgency. "He claims to have witnessed something that could lead us to Robin Hood." The sheriff nodded grimly and gestured for the prisoner to be brought in. The man was disheveled, his clothes ragged and his face bruised. He had clearly been through a rough time since his capture, but his eyes were wide with fear as he looked around the room. The sheriff wasted no time in getting to the point. "Tell me what you know about Robin Hood," he demanded, his voice low and threatening. "What did you see?" The thief swallowed hard, glancing nervously at the guards standing nearby. He hesitated for a moment before speaking, his voice trembling. "I saw him, sir. Robin Hood. He was near the site where one of the noblemen was found dead. He was standing over the body, and he was laughing, like it was some sort of game." The sheriff's blood ran cold at the thief's words. The image of Robin Hood standing over a dead nobleman, laughing as if he were enjoying the kill, was enough to make the sheriff's stomach turn. "Did you see anything else? Anything that could help us?" the sheriff pressed, leaning forward. The thief nodded, his eyes darting around the room nervously. "I saw him leave with some of his men. They were carrying something heavy. It didn't look like just gold. It looked like bodies." The sheriff's hand shot out, gripping the man by the collar and pulling him closer. "Where did they take the bodies?" he demanded. "I don't know, sir," the thief whispered, his voice shaking. "But I know it wasn't just robbery. It was murder. And Robin Hood was behind it." The sheriff's mind raced. He had suspected as much for some time. But now he had a witness, someone who had seen Robin Hood in the act. It was a breakthrough he'd been waiting for. But just as quickly as hope flared within him, it was dashed. The thief's head lolled to one side as he slumped in the sheriff's grip. A cold chill ran down the sheriff's spine as he realized the man was dead. The thief had been killed, but not by his own hand. He had been silenced, his mouth shut for good before he could speak any further. The sheriff quickly moved to the door, barking orders to his men. "Search the prison. Find out who killed him." But as the guards left to carry out his orders, the sheriff stood there, staring at the body. His suspicions about Robin Hood were now confirmed. The man he had once thought of as a mere bandit had turned into something far worse, a cold-blooded killer with a hidden agenda. In the back of his mind, the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that Robin had been toying with him from the very beginning. Every step, every murder, it had all been part of the game. And now, the sheriff was no closer to stopping him than before. With a heavy heart, the sheriff turned to his deputy. "We need to find Robin Hood, and we need to do it quickly. If we don't, he'll continue to kill, and we'll never be able to stop him." His deputy nodded grimly, and together, they left the room, the weight of the situation heavy on their shoulders. The game was no longer about stealing from the rich. It was about something far darker. Robin Hood was a killer, and the sheriff had just become part of his twisted game. Robin Hood stood in the shadow of a towering oak tree, his sharp eyes scanning the quiet streets of Nottingham. The night was still, but he knew the town was ripe for manipulation. The sheriff had grown too close to the truth, and Robin needed a diversion, something to shift the focus away from him. His merry men, ever loyal, stood ready, waiting for the signal. The plan was simple. The sheriff's suspicion had landed on several key figures in Nottingham, but one had stood out: the corrupt tax collector, a man who had bled the villagers dry with exorbitant fees and cruel demands. Robin had watched him for days, and now, it was time to make him the scapegoat. "Move quickly," Robin whispered to Little John, who nodded and disappeared into the darkness with Will Scarlet. The trio was set to kidnap the tax collector, and the rest would follow in an orchestrated series of events designed to pin the blame squarely on his shoulders. The tax collector lived alone in a small, decrepit house near the edge of town. Inside, piles of gold coins and ledgers detailing his corrupt dealings were scattered across the rooms. He had little interest in hiding his wealth, and Robin intended to use this greed to his advantage. The moment the door creaked open, the tax collector barely had time to react before the rope tightened around his wrists. His muffled cries were quickly silenced, and with expert precision, Robin's men bound him, dragging him into the forest, far from prying eyes. It was there, deep in the cover of the woods, that Robin and his merry men worked swiftly. The tax collector was left unconscious, his body sprawled beneath a tangle of branches. They planted a few telltale signs: blood-stained clothing from one of the murder victims, a discarded dagger, and even a note written in the tax collector's handwriting, all in a deliberate effort to frame him. "Let the sheriff find this," Robin muttered, a cold smile creeping across his face. "Let him think he's caught the culprit. It'll buy us time." Once the trap was set, Robin and his men vanished into the night, leaving the tax collector behind. They knew the sheriff would soon arrive, drawn to the scene like a moth to a flame, eager to claim victory. Later that night, as the moon hung low in the sky, the sheriff and his men arrived at the woods. They stumbled upon the scene, and the evidence was undeniable. The body of the tax collector lay motionless, surrounded by the bloody remnants of a murder. A weapon lay nearby, and the note, bearing his distinctive handwriting, was the final nail in the coffin. The sheriff examined the scene, his eyes scanning the clues with practiced precision. For a moment, doubt flickered across his mind. Something felt off, but his thoughts were quickly clouded by his need to wrap up the case. This was the break he had been waiting for. "Call for the tax collector," he barked at his men. The tax collector was dragged in from the nearby forest, barely conscious but still alive. His eyes were wide with fear as he protested his innocence. "I didn't do it," he shouted, his voice hoarse and frantic. "I swear, I'm not guilty. This is a trap." But his cries fell on deaf ears. The sheriff was resolute, convinced that he had finally found the killer. With no evidence to suggest otherwise, the arrest was made, and the tax collector was bound in chains, dragged through the streets of Nottingham. The villagers gathered around, their eyes filled with both fear and relief. They had long despised the tax collector for his cruelty, and now they believed that justice had been served. They cheered as the sheriff led the man away, some even shouting for his execution. Robin watched from a distance, hidden in the shadows, as the spectacle unfolded. His heart hardened with every cheer that echoed through the town square. The villagers, so quick to turn on one of their own, had no idea that the true culprit was still walking free among them. But it mattered little to Robin. The game was progressing just as he had planned. As the sheriff marched the tax collector into the dungeons, Robin allowed himself a small victory, a silent chuckle escaping his lips. His manipulation was working. The innocent man would take the fall, and the sheriff would be none the wiser. But even as he celebrated, a small, nagging feeling of unease began to creep into Robin's mind. His success in framing the tax collector had distracted the sheriff, but it also meant that the sheriff was getting closer to the truth. Robin couldn't afford to let up now. The game had only just begun. Marion's mind raced as she made her way through the dense trees of Sherwood Forest, her footsteps light and calculated. There was something deeply unsettling about Robin's behavior, something that didn't match the heroic figure he had become in the eyes of the villagers. As she walked, her thoughts turned over the strange encounter they had shared earlier, how Robin had brushed off her growing concerns with charm and bravado. But she wasn't convinced. Something lurked behind those eyes, something darker than the man who claimed to fight for justice. She had decided to confront Little John. He had been with Robin for years, and surely he would know something, anything, that could explain Robin's increasingly erratic actions. Little John was loyal, perhaps to a fault, but Marion knew that even the most loyal of men had their breaking points. She found him sharpening his axe by the fire, his posture stiff and his eyes shifting nervously when he saw her approach. "Little John," Marion began, her voice steady but filled with an unspoken urgency. "I need to ask you something." Little John looked up briefly, his large hands pausing mid-swipe on the axe. He swallowed, clearly avoiding her gaze. "What is it, Marion?" She crossed her arms, studying him carefully. "I've been watching Robin lately, and I don't understand. His actions, his methods, they don't seem to line up with the man I thought I knew." Little John's face hardened, and for a split second, his eyes flickered with something that might have been guilt. He quickly cleared his throat and dropped his gaze back to the axe. "Robin is fighting for what's right. You know that." "Do I?" Marion asked, stepping closer. "I've seen him kill without hesitation, Little John. I've seen the fear in the villagers' eyes when they speak of him. I need to understand why he's changing." There was a long pause as Little John continued to avoid her eyes. His silence spoke volumes. Finally, he muttered, "Sometimes, the world changes a man, Marion. You can't always see the cost of what we do until it's too late." His words lingered in the air like a heavy fog. Marion felt a chill crawl up her spine. There was more to this than he was letting on, and the fear that had been slowly building inside her now grew into something far more tangible. "Little John, please," she said, her voice softer now. "If you know something, if you know what Robin's really doing, you have to tell me." But Little John simply shook his head, his large frame sagging with the weight of unspoken truths. "I can't, Marion. You don't understand. Robin is doing what needs to be done. You won't understand until you see it for yourself." Her heart sank, the realization settling in that Little John wasn't going to help her. He was as much a part of Robin's darkening world as the rest of them. She nodded quietly, stepping back and turning away. As Marion left the camp, her mind was already racing with her next move. She needed more answers. There had to be something, some clue that would shed light on what Robin was truly up to. Her thoughts quickly led her back to the cave, the one she had discovered earlier, hidden deep in the forest. The place reeked of secrets, and Marian was determined to uncover them all. The cave was cold and silent when she arrived, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. She moved cautiously, every step echoing against the stone walls. The stash of stolen goods had been left undisturbed, but Marian's eyes weren't focused on the weapons or the blood-stained clothes this time. She had come for something far more elusive, a piece of the puzzle that might finally reveal Robin's true nature. She found it near the back of the cave, half hidden beneath a pile of rags and broken crates. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its cover worn from use. Her heart skipped a beat as she carefully picked it up, feeling the weight of the mystery in her hands. She could already sense that the answers she sought were within its pages. Flipping open the journal, Marian's eyes scanned the pages quickly, searching for anything that could explain Robin's recent actions. As she read, her pulse quickened. The entries were strange, cryptic, filled with phrases like justice through blood and cleansing the world of corruption. Robin had written in a hurried, almost frantic hand, and the words seemed to spill out with a kind of feverish energy. One particular passage caught her eye. The rich will be purged, and in their wake, only the deserving will remain. The world must be cleansed. I will be the one to lead the charge. A shiver ran down Marian's spine as she read those words. This wasn't the Robin Hood she had known, the man who had fought to protect the poor. This was something far darker, a man who was willing to sacrifice everything, even his own soul, in the name of his twisted vision of justice. Her breath caught in her throat as she closed the journal and stuffed it into her cloak. She had found the truth, but now she had to decide what to do with it. The path ahead was murky, and Marian knew that confronting Robin would not be easy. There was no turning back now. She had to expose the man behind the mask before his twisted sense of justice consumed everything in its path. As she left the cave, the weight of the journal pressing against her chest, Marian's thoughts turned to the future. She could no longer ignore the truth. Robin Hood was no hero. He was a killer, and the town of Nottingham would soon learn the cost of following a man driven by darkness. The sheriff stormed into the dimly lit cell where the tax collector sat, his hands bound tightly behind his back. The man's face was gaunt, his eyes wild with panic. It had been hours since his arrest, and the sheriff had grown increasingly frustrated with the lack of progress. He leaned against the cold stone wall, his arms crossed, glaring down at the tax collector. "You're lying," the sheriff growled, his patience fraying. "I know you're involved in these murders, but you're too much of a coward to admit it." The tax collector shook his head vehemently. "I didn't do it. I swear. I've been framed." The sheriff's eyes narrowed. The evidence had been too perfect, too convenient. The tax collector's house had been filled with damning items, making it seem as if he were guilty of the crimes. But now, as the sheriff stared at the man before him, something didn't sit right. He had seen enough corruption in his time to know when someone was being made a scapegoat. Framed? The sheriff's voice was low, dangerous. By who? Who would want to pin these murders on you? The tax collector looked up, his eyes full of fear. "I don't know, Sheriff, but it's Robin Hood. He's the one behind this. He's the one who's been killing the nobles, framing me for his crimes." The sheriff stiffened at the mention of Robin Hood's name. His suspicions had always lingered, but hearing it from the tax collector, who had no reason to lie anymore, brought everything into sharper focus. Robin Hood, the so-called hero of the poor, was the true villain. The sheriff stood up straight, his mind racing. He had to confront the villagers, find out what they knew. There had to be someone who could give him the information he needed to bring Robin Hood to justice. But as he left the cell, his thoughts were interrupted by the angry voices of the townspeople. He stepped out into the village square, where a small crowd had gathered, murmuring and glancing nervously at the sheriff. They all knew the tax collector had been arrested, but none of them would meet the sheriff's eyes. When he finally shouted, demanding answers, the villagers fell silent. "Where is he?" The sheriff's voice was sharp, his gaze cutting through the crowd. "I know someone here knows the truth about Robin Hood. Tell me now, or I'll make sure you all regret it." One by one, the villagers lowered their heads, not daring to speak. The sheriff's heart sank as he realized that no one, absolutely no one, would betray Robin Hood. To them, Robin was a hero. He was the one who had saved them from the corruption of the rich, the one they believed would lead them to a better future. The sheriff clenched his fists, his frustration boiling over. Robin Hood had the entire village under his spell, and no matter how many people he questioned, they would never give him the truth. But the sheriff wasn't about to give up. He stormed out of the square, determined to find another way to expose Robin's true nature. And as fate would have it, he was soon to meet the one person who might hold the key to unlocking the mystery, Marion. Marion stood in the quiet corner of the tavern when the sheriff entered, his face grim. He spotted her immediately, her gaze fixed on her drink, and walked over to her table, his expression unreadable. Without a word, he pulled up a chair and sat across from her. "I've had enough of this," the sheriff muttered, rubbing his temples in frustration. "The villagers are protecting Robin Hood, and no one will tell me anything. But I know he's behind the murders. I just can't prove it." Marion looked at the sheriff, her face a mask of concern. "You're right," she said softly. "I've been watching him too, and there's something off about him. I don't believe he's the hero everyone thinks he is. I've seen things, heard things, that make me question everything I thought I knew about him." The sheriff's eyes widened slightly, his hope reigniting. "So you agree with me?" Marion nodded slowly, her fingers tapping nervously on the table. "Yes, but we need to be careful. Robin is powerful, and he's got the loyalty of the entire village. If we're going to expose him, we'll have to do it quietly, without tipping him off. We need to gather evidence, find out where he's been hiding all this time, and learn his true motives." The sheriff's jaw clenched, his resolve hardening. He had no intention of letting Robin Hood get away with his crimes. Together with Marion, they would unravel the web of lies, no matter what it took. "Then let's get to work," the sheriff said, his voice low and determined. "We'll catch Robin Hood, and when we do, we'll make sure he pays for everything." Marion met his gaze, her expression firm. For the first time in a long while, she felt a spark of hope. She wasn't sure what the future held, but one thing was clear. The truth would come to light, and Robin Hood's reign of terror was about to end. Marion's heart raced as she stood in the middle of the dense forest, holding up the blood-stained clothes she had discovered in the hidden cave. The fabric was dark, soaked through with blood that had long since dried into a sickening brown. She could feel her hands trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she confronted the man who had once been her hero. The man who had claimed to be the protector of the poor, the one who had stolen from the rich to give to those who had nothing. "Robin," she demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and fear, "explain this. These clothes, they belong to a nobleman. Why are they covered in blood? What have you done?" Robin stood across from her, his face calm, his posture relaxed. He didn't seem at all surprised to be confronted, as if he had anticipated this moment. Slowly, he reached out and took the clothes from her hands, his fingers brushing hers in a fleeting moment of contact. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, Marion saw nothing but the coldness in them. "These clothes," Robin began, his voice steady, "belonged to a nobleman I had to kill. It was in self-defense. He was threatening the people, trying to take what little they had left. I did what I had to do to protect them, to protect you." His eyes softened for a brief instant, a semblance of tenderness flickering in his gaze. "I'm doing all of this to stop the tyranny, Marion. You know that." His words were soothing, like a balm meant to ease her troubled mind. But as Marion stood there, listening to him speak, something didn't sit right. There was a flicker in his eyes, something dark and dangerous, that she couldn't ignore. It was as if he wasn't telling her the whole truth, as if there was a deeper, more sinister motive behind his actions. The more she looked at him, the more she felt like she was staring into the eyes of a stranger. "I'm trying to save everyone," Robin continued, his voice growing softer, more earnest. "You know I would never hurt you. I've always cared for you, Marion." But as his words lingered in the air, Marion felt a cold shiver crawl up her spine. The warmth in his voice didn't reach his eyes. The intensity in his gaze felt like a warning, something she couldn't quite place. And suddenly, she realized just how far down the rabbit hole she had gone, how deeply entangled she was in Robin's world of lies and deception. Marion swallowed hard, trying to steady her breath as she stepped back, her mind spinning with confusion. Was Robin the hero she had once believed him to be, or was he something far darker? Something far more dangerous? She turned away, the weight of the moment pressing down on her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was in over her head, that the man she had trusted with her heart was not the man she thought he was. She had to find the truth, no matter the cost. But as Marion walked away, she felt Robin's gaze following her, unwavering and cold. She glanced over her shoulder, her eyes meeting his once more, and saw the same dark flicker, stronger this time, more intense. His face was unreadable, a mask of calm. Yet, as the camera zoomed in on his expression, there was no mistaking the menace lurking behind his eyes. The danger was there, silent but undeniable. And as Marion disappeared into the trees, Robin stood still, watching her, a cold, calculating smile playing at the corners of his lips. What was he truly capable of? And how much longer would it be before Marion realized the truth about him? The screen faded to black, leaving the audience in suspense, the question of Robin Hood's true nature hanging in the air, unresolved and chilling. Little John felt the weight of uncertainty pressing on him as he observed Robin during the raid. The air was thick with tension as they moved through the village, their goal clear. Take what was needed from the rich, and leave behind chaos for the corrupt to ponder. Robin led the charge, his movements swift and precise, his face a mask of determination. But as the raid unfolded, Little John's heart sank. A nobleman, terrified and trembling, had surrendered. His hands were raised high, begging for mercy. But Robin showed no sign of hesitation. Without a second thought, he fired an arrow straight into the man's chest, watching as the nobleman fell to the ground, lifeless. The scream of the man echoed in the silence that followed, but it was drowned out by the sound of Robin's voice, cold and indifferent. "This is what justice looks like," Robin said, turning his back on the fallen man without a flicker of remorse. Little John froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He had seen Robin fight for justice before, had heard him speak of bringing balance to the world. But this was different. Robin's eyes had been devoid of the compassion that had once fueled his actions. There was a darkness now, a cruelty that Little John couldn't ignore. After the raid, as the camp settled into the quiet of the night, Little John found himself alone with his thoughts. The memory of the murder gnawed at him, and he couldn't shake the feeling that something was deeply wrong with Robin. He decided to investigate further, to find out what had changed in his friend. As Little John sorted through Robin's equipment, something caught his eye. An arrow, blood-stained and misshapen, was stuck in the ground near Robin's tent. It looked familiar. Little John's stomach twisted as he recognized it. It was the same type of arrow used in the murder of the nobleman earlier. A chill ran down his spine as he realized the weapon matched the one from the recent killings. His suspicions grew, but he was torn. Robin had been his friend for years, his leader, the one who had brought them all together for a common cause. Could he truly be behind these murders? The doubts plagued Little John's mind, but he knew one thing for sure. Robin was hiding something, and that something could destroy them all. Marion's heart raced as she met the sheriff in the dead of night, hidden beneath the canopy of trees. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and the sound of distant rustling leaves. The weight of what she was about to share hung heavily on her. For weeks, she had wrestled with the dark suspicions she harbored about Robin, torn between her loyalty to him and the truth she feared would shatter everything she believed in. She handed the sheriff the journal she had found in the hidden cave, her fingers trembling as she recounted the grim discoveries. "I've seen what he's capable of," she whispered, the words feeling like a betrayal. "His actions, they're no longer about justice. There's a darkness in him I never noticed before." The sheriff listened in silence, his face grim as he absorbed the information. He had suspected Robin for some time, but hearing it from Marion gave him the clarity he needed. The pieces were finally falling into place. The murders, the framing of the tax collector, and the strange, obsessive need to control the poor. It all pointed to one man, Robin Hood. "I've suspected him for a while," the sheriff said, his voice low and measured, "but I needed proof. And now, thanks to you, We have it. Marion's chest tightened as the reality of their plans settled in. The sheriff was right. The only way to stop Robin and protect the village was to expose him for what he truly was. But that didn't make it any easier. Robin had been her ally, her confidant, even a friend. How could she betray him now? The sheriff's expression softened, but there was no room for compassion in this moment. We need to act quickly, he urged. Robin's growing more dangerous by the day. We can't let him slip away again. The two of them set off together, moving through the dense forest like shadows, their eyes scanning for any sign of Robin's merry men. Marion felt a cold sweat on her brow as they trudged deeper into the woods. It was the same forest she had wandered countless times with Robin, the same trees that had once felt like home, but tonight they felt foreign, menacing, as if the forest itself was conspiring against them. They crept along the path, careful not to make a sound. The wind rustled through the leaves, and every crack of a twig beneath their feet sent their hearts racing. Suddenly, Marion's breath caught in her throat. In the distance, she saw a figure, a shadow moving swiftly between the trees. It was one of Robin's men. She froze, and the sheriff motioned for her to stay silent. They hid behind a thick bush, watching as the merry man disappeared further into the woods. Marion's pulse quickened. Robin's men were always close, always watching, and if they were caught now, their mission would be over. They waited in silence, the minutes stretching into what felt like hours. The merry men eventually passed, and Marion and the sheriff continued their search, their steps growing bolder. The forest felt more oppressive with every passing moment, the weight of their secret pressing down on them. Marion's mind raced, torn between the betrayal she was about to commit and the need to stop the terror Robin had unleashed. The deeper they went, the more certain Marion became that the truth had to come out, no matter the cost. As Marion and the sheriff pushed deeper into the heart of the forest, the air grew colder, the silence more oppressive. Every step seemed to echo, as though the forest itself was holding its breath. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they stumbled upon something hidden. A small, concealed cave, barely noticeable unless you knew exactly where to look. The entrance was choked with thick vines and undergrowth, as if nature itself was trying to keep it hidden. The sheriff gestured for Marion to follow him inside, his hand resting on his dagger, alert for any signs of danger. As they entered the lair, the scent of musty earth mixed with something far more sinister, dried blood, and the sharp, metallic tang of old death. The walls were adorned with trophies from Robin's victims, jewelry, watches, and weapons, all items that had been stolen during the murders. A sense of revulsion rose within Marion as she examined the gruesome evidence. A golden ring, an engraved brooch, a dagger with an intricate hilt, all symbols of the lives that had been violently taken. These were the belongings of innocent people, victims of the man she had once admired. As they ventured further into the lair, Marion's eyes landed on a large wooden table, littered with maps and sketches. On the surface, she saw a map of Nottinghamshire, marked with locations, each one corresponding to the sites where the murders had occurred. The realization hit her like a blow to the chest. Robin had orchestrated these killings all along. Every raid, every action he had taken, had been part of a far darker plan. He hadn't been seeking justice. He had been feeding his own insatiable thirst for vengeance. Marion's hands trembled as she picked up a small, ornate locket lying on the table. As she opened it, a small portrait of a young woman stared back at her, one of the victims. Tears welled up in Marion's eyes as the weight of everything she had failed to see crushed her. She had seen Robin as a hero, as someone fighting for the oppressed, but now she understood the truth. He wasn't a hero. He was a killer, and the people he had murdered were nothing more than pawns in his twisted game of justice. The sheriff stood silently beside her, his eyes scanning the room with cold determination. "This is it, Marion," he said, his voice low but firm. "This is the evidence we need to bring him to justice. Robin Hood is not the man we thought he was. He's nothing more than a monster hiding in plain sight." Marion nodded, her chest tight with guilt and fear. She had been blinded by Robin's charisma, his vision of rebellion. But now the reality of what he had become was undeniable. She had to stop him, for the sake of the innocent lives that had been lost. The sheriff's face hardened, his jaw clenched with resolve. Robin Hood will pay for his crimes, no matter what it takes. As they prepared to leave the lair, the weight of their discovery hung heavily on them both. The path ahead was uncertain, dangerous, but one thing was clear. Robin could no longer be allowed to continue his reign of terror, and Marian knew, deep in her heart, that the confrontation that was coming would be the most difficult thing she had ever done. Robin's instincts had always been sharp, honed through years of evading the sheriff and his men. But recently, something had been off about Little John. The towering figure had always been his most trusted ally, the one person Robin had relied on without question. But now, Little John seemed distant, his eyes clouded with doubt. Robin couldn't ignore the subtle signs any longer. The unease in Little John's posture, the way he hesitated before answering Robin's commands, the fleeting moments when their eyes didn't meet with the usual unwavering loyalty. It wasn't long before Robin decided to investigate. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the shadows grew longer, he silently followed Little John as he ventured into the forest. The weight of his bow was comforting in his hand, the familiar feel of the weapon a reminder of his purpose. He moved through the trees with practiced stealth, careful not to make a sound, until he saw Little John stop in a small clearing. Robin's heart skipped a beat as he saw Little John talking to Marian, his posture tense, his voice low and cautious. Robin's blood boiled as he watched, hidden behind the thick trunks of the trees. He knew Marian had been investigating him. He had seen the way her gaze lingered on him with suspicion. But he had hoped that Little John would remain loyal, that the bond they shared would be enough to keep him from doubting the cause. But now, it seemed, even Little John had started questioning the truth. Robin's anger surged, and he couldn't hold back any longer. He stepped out of the shadows, his voice like ice as he spoke. "What's this, John? A secret meeting with Marian?" Little John froze, his face pale in the moonlight. "Robin, don't lie to me." Robin's voice thundered through the clearing. "I've seen you. I've been watching you. You think I don't know what you're up to?" Little John's eyes flicked nervously between Robin and Marian. "I'm not turning against you, Robin. I'm just trying to understand." "Understand what?" Robin snapped, stepping closer. His hand tightened around the hilt of his sword, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal. "You think this is about justice? About saving the poor? No. This is about eliminating the corrupt, eradicating the ones who deserve to die. I'm the one who's been fighting for what's right." "I haven't betrayed you," Little John said, his voice shaky but firm. "I'm just confused. We've lost so many. The people we've hurt, are we really doing the right thing?" Robin's gaze darkened, his lips curling into a twisted smile. "You're questioning me now?" His voice was low and dangerous. "If you turn against me, you'll regret it. I'll make sure of it." Little John stepped back, his face a mixture of fear and guilt. "Robin, please, I'm not—" "You're treading dangerous ground, John," Robin said, his tone cold and unforgiving. "If you doubt me again, if you side with him, you won't just be my enemy. You'll be a traitor, and I don't tolerate traitors." Little John's eyes hardened, the resolve he had once shown in their cause flickering. "I'm not your enemy, Robin," he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Robin stared at him for a long moment, his mind turning over the possibilities. He knew Little John wasn't the type to betray him lightly, but the seed of doubt had been planted. In the depths of his paranoia, Robin began to wonder just how far he could trust anyone, even his closest allies. With a final, sharp glance at Little John, he turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving the tension hanging in the air like a storm waiting to break. As the sound of Robin's footsteps faded into the night, Little John stood there, shaken and uncertain. The weight of the confrontation had left him conflicted, loyalty to Robin, or the truth about the path they were walking. And Marian, standing nearby, watched with a mix of fear and sympathy. She knew that Robin was slipping further into madness, but she also knew that saving him might mean losing everything. As the days passed, Robin's once steadfast control over his merry men began to slip, His leadership, once revered for its charisma and sense of justice, now teetered on the edge of madness. Each raid became more brutal, more reckless. Robin's orders grew harsher, and his men were left with no choice but to follow him or face his wrath. The thrill of taking from the rich and powerful had morphed into an insatiable bloodlust, and Robin's desire for retribution seemed to know no bounds. The merry men, once loyal to a man they believed was their hero, now found themselves questioning their place in Robin's twisted vision. Whispers began to spread among the group, quiet murmurs of doubt, of unease. Some of them had seen the changes in Robin, his coldness growing with every passing day, his eyes filled with an unsettling darkness that even they couldn't ignore. Little John had already begun to wonder if Robin was still the man he had followed into the forest all those years ago. And now, others were starting to feel the same. They no longer saw the Robin Hood they had once admired. The leader who had fought for the oppressed, who had made them feel like they were part of something greater. No, this Robin was a stranger, a man whose thirst for violence seemed insatiable. But any talk of doubt was quickly silenced. Robin's eyes flashed with anger whenever someone dared to question his decisions. The merry men knew what happened to those who spoke out of turn. Robin didn't tolerate weakness, especially not in his own ranks. His voice grew louder, his commands more demanding. "We raid tonight," he would bark, his tone final. "We take what is ours, and we take more. We will not stop until the world is cleansed. Do you hear me?" And yet, in the depths of his mind, a fear began to take root. Robin knew that his grip on his men was slipping. The loyalty that had once been unwavering was starting to crumble, and in his desperation to hold on to power, he made decisions that would only push him further into the darkness. It was Will Scarlet, one of Robin's most trusted allies, who had the courage to confront him. Will had been with Robin from the very beginning, through every raid, every battle, but now, as he watched the violence escalate, the lives taken with no remorse, he could no longer ignore what was happening. "Robin," Will said, his voice shaky but determined, "this isn't what we fought for. These murders, they're not justice. We're becoming just like the people we sought to overthrow." Robin's eyes narrowed, the calm facade cracking. "You think I'm becoming like them?" he spat, his voice low and dangerous. "I'm doing what needs to be done. We've been held down for too long. If you can't see that, then maybe you're not the man I thought you were." Will stepped closer, his face filled with disbelief. "You've lost yourself, Robin. We've crossed a line, and you know it. This isn't justice. It's slaughter." The words hit Robin like a physical blow. He felt the anger surge within him, blinding him to everything but the need to assert control, to show that he was still the one in charge. His hand moved to his sword, the cold steel a familiar weight, and in a fit of rage, he drew it with deadly speed. Will didn't even have a chance to react as the blade sliced through the air, cutting through his chest in one fluid motion. The room fell silent. Will's body crumpled to the ground, the blood staining the earth beneath him as Robin stood over him, his chest heaving with the force of his breath. For a moment, he just stared at the lifeless form of his closest friend. The reality of what he had just done began to sink in, but he pushed it aside. The merry men stood frozen, unable to move or speak. Horror filled their eyes as they looked from Robin to Will's body, then back at Robin, whose expression had turned cold and distant. The man they had once trusted, the man who had led them with a sense of righteousness, had just killed one of their own in a fit of rage. They could see it now, the monster Robin had become, but none of them dared to speak up. Fear had taken root in their hearts. They knew what Robin was capable of, and they knew that if they challenged him, they would suffer the same fate as Will. So they stood there, paralyzed by fear, as Robin turned on his heel and stormed out of the clearing, leaving the body of his once loyal friend behind. As Robin disappeared into the night, the merry men remained silent, their minds filled with a growing dread. What had they become? And what would Robin do next? Marion's heart pounded in her chest as she returned to the village, her mind a whirlwind of doubts and fears. She had seen the horrors, felt the weight of the truth pressing down on her, but the villagers refused to acknowledge it. They still clung to the image of Robin Hood as their hero, The man who had stolen from the rich to give to the poor. The man who had led them through years of hardship with promises of a better future. But Marion had seen the darkness in Robin's eyes. She had uncovered the blood-stained evidence, the hidden trophies, and the twisted journal. And now, more than ever, she knew the truth. Robin was no longer the hero they believed him to be. He had become something far more dangerous, far more sinister. She approached the villagers in the square, her voice shaking as she tried to make them understand. Robin, he's not what you think. He's been killing people, innocent people. You have to believe me. But the villagers, loyal to Robin as they were, simply shook their heads, dismissing her warnings. Robin would never harm us, one of them said, his tone filled with conviction. He's our protector. We owe him everything. Marion's frustration boiled over. She tried to reason with them, to show them the evidence she had found, but it was like speaking to a wall. The villagers' blind devotion to Robin was too strong, too ingrained. They would not listen to reason. Realizing that she couldn't change their minds with words alone, Marion felt a cold determination settle over her. She knew what had to be done. The only way to stop Robin, to make the villagers see the truth, was to expose him for the monster he had become. But to do that, she needed more evidence. Something undeniable. Something that would shatter the illusion of Robin's heroism once and for all. It was then that the sheriff arrived, his face grim and resolute. He had been following Marion's investigation closely, and now, after everything that had transpired, he had come to a decision. We need to set a trap, he said quietly, his eyes meeting Marion's. We'll use you as bait. Marion's stomach twisted at the thought. The idea of putting herself in Robin's path, knowing how dangerous he had become, was terrifying. But deep down, she knew it was the only way. Robin still cared for her, and that weakness, if it could even be called that, was their only hope of drawing him out. You're sure about this? Marion asked, her voice low but steady. The sheriff nodded. We have no choice. We know Robin won't be able to resist. If we make it look like you're alone, he'll come to you. And when he does, we'll have the evidence we need to bring him down. Marion's heart raced at the thought of facing Robin again, but she steeled herself. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about stopping a killer, saving the people she cared about, and exposing the truth once and for all. I'm in, Marion said, her voice firm, her resolve stronger than it had ever been. The sheriff gave her a small, appreciative nod. Good. We'll move at nightfall. As Marion left the village square, she felt a cold determination settle in her chest. The next few hours would be the most dangerous of her life. But she couldn't back down now. Robin had to be stopped, no matter the cost. Marion's heart raced as she walked deeper into the dense forest, the wind rustling through the leaves, masking her anxious steps. She had rehearsed every word, every gesture, but now that she was face to face with Robin, the gravity of the situation was overwhelming. Her mind was a storm of emotions, torn between the man she had once loved and the monster he had become. She needed to convince him, make him believe she was on his side, so they could end this once and for all. She finally spotted him standing near a large oak, his figure silhouetted against the twilight sky. Robin Hood, the infamous outlaw, the hero of the people, stood before her, his sharp eyes watching her with a mix of caution and curiosity. Robin, Marion called softly, her voice barely more than a whisper. She took a step closer, her hands trembling at her sides. I know you've been struggling. The killings, everything. But I still believe in you. I always have. Robin's gaze softened, but there was a hint of suspicion in his eyes. What's this, Marion? You've been distant for weeks now. You're suddenly here, pretending to care? Marion hesitated for a moment, her thoughts racing. I've seen the way the villagers talk about you, the way they worship you. But it's not you, Robin. It's the idea of you. You don't have to be this man anymore. She stepped closer, her voice pleading. Leave it all behind. We can go away together. We can start a new life, free from all the violence, free from the bloodshed. For a fleeting moment, Robin's face softened, the coldness in his eyes replaced by something almost human. He took a step forward, his voice low and hesitant. I could. I could have everything. You and me. A life without these chains. But Marion's heart sank. She knew she had slipped up. Her mention of the hidden lair, the trophies, the evidence she had found. Robin's eyes hardened immediately, suspicion flashing across his face. You know too much, he said in a chilling whisper, his expression turning cold once again. You should have stayed out of this, Marion. Before she could respond, the sound of hooves and footsteps echoed through the trees. Marion's eyes widened in panic. Robin's head snapped around, realizing too late that the sheriff and his men had ambushed him. Marion, Robin hissed, his voice filled with a mix of betrayal and fury. She took a step back, her heart in her throat. The sheriff's men emerged from the shadows, weapons drawn. But Robin was quick, too quick. He moved like a predator, his eyes gleaming with calculated intent. A brutal fight erupted. Robin's movements were fluid and precise, each strike with his sword or bow a deadly dance. The sheriff's men tried to close in on him, but Robin outmaneuvered them with terrifying efficiency, darting through the trees, disappearing into the shadows as if he were one with the forest itself. Marion watched in shock as the chaos unfolded. The sheriff's men were falling behind, struggling to keep up with Robin's speed and cunning. He was a force of nature, a man pushed to the edge, fighting not just for survival, but for his twisted vision of justice. A dramatic chase ensued, with Robin leading his pursuers through the dense underbrush. He knew every rock, every tree, every path in the forest. The sheriff and his men struggled to keep up, their breath coming in heavy gasps as they stumbled through the darkened woods. Robin's laughter echoed through the trees, a maddening sound that chilled Marion to her core. She watched, frozen, as the forest seemed to swallow him whole. Robin Hood, once the hero of the people, was now a man on the run, a fugitive from the truth he had buried beneath lies and bloodshed. As the chase continued, Marion's heart sank. This wasn't the man she had once known. This wasn't the Robin she had believed in. She had no choice but to let him go, at least for now. But deep down, she knew that the next time they met, it would be a fight to the end. The tension in the air was suffocating as Robin cornered Marion against a large rock, his eyes burning with fury and disbelief. His once kind features were twisted by anger, and his grip on his bow tightened, the string taut with the promise of violence. Why, Marion? Why did you betray me? He growled, his voice low and menacing. Marion's heart hammered in her chest. She had never seen Robin like this. Not this cold, this ruthless. I didn't betray you, Robin. I'm trying to save you. I've seen what you've become. Please, surrender. It's not too late to stop this. But Robin was beyond reason. His expression darkened, and the bowstring quivered as he raised the weapon. You never understood. You never could. Before Marion could respond, the clash of steel rang out through the trees as the sheriff arrived, sword in hand, determination in his eyes. Robin Hood, he shouted, his voice commanding. This ends now. Robin's eyes narrowed, his expression now one of pure defiance. With a swift motion, he drew his sword and engaged the sheriff, the two clashing in a flurry of strikes. Steel met steel with a deafening clang, the sounds of the battle echoing through the forest. Robin's agility and skill were unmatched, and he quickly gained the upper hand, pushing the sheriff back with relentless strikes. Marion watched helplessly, her own heart torn between fear and regret. She could see the sheriff struggling to keep up with Robin's speed, the weight of their past friendship evident in his every movement. The forest around them seemed to close in, as if the very earth itself was conspiring against the sheriff's attempts to bring Robin to justice. But just as the fight reached its peak, Robin's eyes flicked toward Marion one last time. In that moment, it was clear that something inside him had shifted. His gaze, filled with a dark determination, told her that this wasn't over. With a swift, devastating strike, he disarmed the sheriff and pushed him back with a final, brutal blow. Then, without hesitation, Robin turned and fled into the forest, his figure vanishing into the shadows with the speed of a ghost. The sheriff, bleeding and bruised, stumbled to his feet, cursing under his breath. He's escaped again. Marion watched in stunned silence, the weight of the moment crashing down on her. Her thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. Robin had been a hero to her, but now, she was no longer sure what he was. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the darkness that had consumed him. But she also saw the man she once loved, the Robin who had fought for justice. As the sheriff cursed again, vowing to track Robin down, Marian turned her gaze toward the horizon. Robin was out there, somewhere. His rage and confusion now mingled with something more dangerous. The village was not safe. Nothing was safe. From a distance, a figure stood on a cliff overlooking the village, his silhouette framed by the dying light of the day. Robin Hood, alone, looking down at the place he had once called home, his heart a storm of anger, betrayal, and determination. His eyes gleamed with a terrifying resolve. As the sheriff gritted his teeth, making his vow to hunt Robin down, Marian couldn't help but wonder. Was there any humanity left in him? Or had he truly become the monster the world feared? The cliffhanger hung in the air, thick with anticipation. The fate of Robin, Marian, and the village was now uncertain, and the final confrontation loomed closer than ever before. The village square was tense, filled with whispers and fearful glances as Marian and the sheriff returned with the damning evidence from Robin's hidden lair. The golden morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the cobbled streets as they made their way toward the gathering crowd. In Marian's hand, she clutched a bundle wrapped in cloth. The map, the locket, the trophies, pieces of the puzzle they could no longer ignore. When the villagers saw the items, the air grew thick with disbelief and growing horror. Marian unfurled the map, showing the locations marked with red crosses, each one a symbol of the deaths that had plagued the forest. She held up a piece of jewelry, a locket belonging to one of Robin's victims, and the faces of the crowd grew pale. "This is what your hero has been doing," she said, her voice steady but full of sorrow. "He has been killing in the shadows, manipulating us all." The villagers exchanged horrified glances, their faith in the man they once hailed as a protector beginning to unravel. The weight of the truth sank in like a heavy stone, and murmurs filled the air as people began to step back, questioning everything they had once believed about Robin. In the midst of the tense silence, Little John stepped forward, his face hardened with grief and betrayal. The crowd fell silent as he drew the blood-stained arrow from his quiver, holding it up for all to see. "This arrow," he began, his voice heavy, "matches the ones found near the bodies. It came from Robin's quiver. I saw him kill in cold blood. Our leader, our friend, is no better than the men he fought against." The villagers recoiled, their disbelief slowly morphing into disgust. Robin, once the beacon of hope, now stood as the symbol of their greatest fear. The weight of Little John's words echoed in the air, and the final threads of loyalty to Robin began to snap. Robin stood at the edge of the village, hidden in the shadows, watching the scene unfold before him. His heart raced, the sting of betrayal biting deeper than any wound he had ever known. He stepped forward, facing Little John and the villagers. "You think you know me? You think you understand what I've done?" His voice trembled with fury, but his eyes burned with a cold, calculating fire. The villagers were silent, waiting for Robin's defense. But there was nothing he could say. The truth had already been revealed. His grip tightened around his bow, but Little John, once his most loyal companion, did not flinch. The trust that had bound them together was now broken. Robin's heart sank, and in that moment, he realized the battle was over. His people, the ones he fought for, the ones he loved, had turned against him. His world was crumbling, piece by piece, and all he had left was a twisted sense of righteousness. "Little John, you know me," Robin said, his voice hoarse with desperation. "You know I did it for you, for all of us. But they don't understand." Little John shook his head, his face pale with grief. "I was blind, Robin. You've gone too far. I can't follow you down this path anymore." The villagers stood in shocked silence, their hearts heavy with sorrow. The hero they had once loved was now the villain they had to fight against. The stage was set for the final confrontation. The night was thick with tension as Little John, Marian, and the sheriff met in the woods, hidden beneath the towering trees where moonlight barely touched the forest floor. The fire in the clearing flickered low, casting long shadows over their faces. Little John's broad shoulders were slumped in defeat, but his eyes held a newfound determination. He had made his decision. "I can't do this anymore," Little John confessed, his voice quiet but resolute. "Robin has gone too far. He's not the man we thought he was. He's a monster." He ran a hand through his beard, staring into the fire as if searching for the right words. "I've seen enough, heard enough, to know I'm not helping him anymore." Marion glanced at the sheriff, who gave a small nod. It was the first time they'd heard Little John speak so openly about the betrayal he had to carry out. "So, you'll help us bring him to justice?" Marion asked, her voice steady but carrying a weight of its own. Little John hesitated for a moment, his face clouded with grief. The bond he had once shared with Robin, the years of camaraderie and trust, had been shattered beyond repair. But there was no turning back now. "I will. Robin needs to face what he's done." Together, they began to devise their plan. The next raid was imminent, and it would be the perfect opportunity to catch Robin off guard. Little John would go back to Robin's camp, pretending to remain loyal. He would give them the signal when the time was right, and they would ambush him during the raid. Robin would never suspect that his closest ally was the one to turn him in. "This is it then," the sheriff said, his voice low. "We can end this tonight." Little John nodded, though a dark cloud seemed to hang over him. There was no joy in betrayal, but the weight of Robin's crimes left him with little choice. He didn't know if he could ever look at himself the same way after this, but he knew that justice needed to be served. As they parted ways, Marion watched Little John disappear into the shadows, a knot tightening in her stomach. She didn't know how the night would unfold, but one thing was certain. This was the end of Robin's reign. Back at Robin's camp, the tension was palpable. His merry men were gathered around a fire, their faces hard with suspicion. Robin stood at the center, pacing back and forth, his mind a storm of paranoia. He could feel it, the doubt, the shift in the air. Something wasn't right. Little John entered the camp, his large frame casting a long shadow as he walked in. His face remained unreadable, but his eyes, Robin noticed, seemed distant, colder than usual. Robin stopped in his tracks, his instincts prickling with unease. "Little John," he called, his voice sharp. "Where have you been? We need to prepare for the raid." Little John nodded, his expression neutral, but the tightness in his jaw betrayed his discomfort. "Everything's ready, Robin. We'll take the village by force, like always." Robin narrowed his eyes, his gaze lingering on Little John a moment longer. There was something in the way he spoke, something that didn't sit right with him. His instincts were never wrong, and tonight, they screamed that Little John was hiding something. "Good," Robin said, his voice icy, "but you'd better keep your eyes open. Trust no one but me, not even your own shadow." The words sent a chill down Little John's spine. Robin's warning was as much a command as it was a threat, and Little John felt the weight of it press heavily on his chest. He had made his decision, but now, in this moment, as he met Robin's cold gaze, he couldn't help but feel the full brunt of the betrayal weighing on him. "Of course, Robin," Little John replied, his voice steady, but inside, his heart was heavy. He turned and made his way to his tent, knowing that this was the beginning of the end. Robin watched him, his mind racing. He had no idea how, but something was off. Little John was hiding something. He could feel it in his bones. And if his closest ally was turning against him, then nothing was safe. As Robin paced the camp, a quiet dread settled over him. The trap was closing in, but he had no idea just how close it was. The sun was beginning to dip behind the trees, casting the forest in a soft, golden glow. Marion stood in the woods alone, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she had to make. The cool breeze rustled the leaves, carrying with it the faint scent of pine and earth, but it did little to calm the storm raging inside her. She had come here seeking solace, a moment of clarity away from the chaos of the village and the constant reminders of Robin's dark path. As she walked deeper into the forest, her eyes caught something on the ground, a small, delicate keepsake. It was the pendant Robin had once given her, the one she wore close to her heart in better days. She picked it up, feeling its cold metal against her fingers, and for a moment, she was back in that simpler time, when Robin had been her hero and their love had seemed pure. A flashback consumed her thoughts. She remembered the laughter they shared, the warmth in his eyes, the promises he had whispered to her under the starry sky. In those moments, she had believed in him fully. She had believed in the man he once was. But those memories quickly darkened as the faces of the victims flashed before her mind's eye. The blood-stained arrow, the cries of the innocent, the way Robin had coldly taken lives without remorse. The joy and hope she once felt now felt like a lie, a dream shattered by the horrors he had committed. Tears threatened to fall, but Marion wiped them away. She had to make a choice, one that would define the rest of her life. Could she still love a man who had become a monster? Could she ignore the truth for the sake of her heart? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps behind her. She turned to see the sheriff, his face grim but understanding. He had been patient with her, allowing her time to come to terms with everything, but he knew that this moment was inevitable. Marion held the pendant tightly in her hand, her eyes never leaving the sheriff's face. "I've made my decision," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "I can't let Robin keep doing this. He's not the man I thought he was." The sheriff stepped forward, his expression softening slightly. "I know how hard this is, Marion, but you're doing the right thing. The village needs justice, and Robin needs to face what he's done. This is the only way." Marion nodded, though a part of her still longed for the man Robin once was, the Robin she had loved. But deep down, she knew that man was gone, consumed by his own darkness. The Robin she had known no longer existed. "I have to help stop him," Marion said, her voice steady now, "for the sake of the village, and for those he's hurt. But it doesn't mean I won't mourn what's lost." The sheriff placed a hand on her shoulder, his grip reassuring. "You're not alone in this, Marion. Together, we'll bring him to justice." She gave a small, bitter smile, knowing that the road ahead would be difficult, but she couldn't turn back. Robin's betrayal had carved a wound in her heart, but she had to do what was right. For the villagers. For herself. As they walked back toward the village, Marion couldn't help but feel the heaviness of the choice she had made. She had chosen justice over love, but she knew the pain of losing Robin would stay with her forever. The path ahead was uncertain, but she had no other option. The man she loved was gone, and all that was left was the truth. The moon hung high in the sky, casting a pale light over the dense forest. The air was thick with tension as the sheriff's men took their positions, each soldier silently creeping into the underbrush, their eyes scanning the shadows for any sign of movement. They were prepared for this moment, the moment when Robin Hood would finally face the consequences of his dark actions. But no one dared to speak, knowing that the smallest sound could give them away. Marion stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding in her chest. She could hear the distant sounds of Robin's men, their boisterous voices growing louder as they approached the raid location. She exchanged a quick, nervous glance with Little John, who was standing beside her. His face was unreadable, but Marion could see the unease in his eyes. He had betrayed Robin, and though the villagers would likely never forgive him, Little John knew this was the only way to end the madness. "Are you ready?" Marion whispered, her voice low but steady. Little John gave a tight nod. "I'll do my part. Let's just hope it works." The plan had been set. Marion would draw Robin into the clearing by pretending to need help, and Little John would act as if he were still loyal to his old friend. They had to make Robin think everything was normal, right up until the moment the trap was sprung. Marion's hands shook slightly as she moved deeper into the forest, pretending to stumble as if she were caught in the underbrush. She called out, her voice loud enough to carry through the trees. "Robin! Robin! Help me!" A rustle in the distance signaled Robin's arrival, and Marion's breath hitched in her throat. She had seen Robin's ruthlessness, but this moment, this confrontation, was the one she had been dreading. As she waited, the familiar sound of Robin's deep voice rang out from the darkness. "Marion?" His voice was laced with concern, but there was an edge to it, a dangerous undertone. "What's going on? Where are you?" Marion hesitated. as if torn between playing the part and giving away the truth. But before she could finish her sentence, the sound of footsteps behind her made her heart race. It wasn't just Robin who had arrived, it was his entire gang, and they were ready for a fight. Robin stepped into the clearing, his sharp eyes immediately scanning the area. He narrowed them when he saw Little John standing nearby, arms crossed, his expression tense. The tension in the air thickened. "What is this, Little John?" Robin's voice was cold, his eyes flashing with suspicion. "You've been acting strange lately. What's going on?" Little John stood firm, his jaw tight. "I can't stand by you anymore, Robin. I've seen too much." He glanced at Marion, his guilt evident in the way he avoided her gaze. "I'm done." A dangerous silence followed. Robin's gaze flickered between Little John and Marion, and his expression twisted into one of disbelief. "You're betraying me too, then?" His voice dripped with venom, his hand tightening around the hilt of his sword. Little John's stance remained unchanged, but Marion could see the subtle trembling of his fingers. "I can't ignore what you've become. You're not the man we fought for, Robin." Robin's lips curled into a sneer, and he stepped closer to Little John, his eyes filled with fury. "You think you can take me down? After everything we've been through? I made you who you are." Marion held her breath as the standoff unfolded. She had expected this, but the reality of it was far more terrifying than she had imagined. Robin was no longer the man she had once known. He was consumed by rage, and she could see the dark reflection of the murderer he had become. The air was thick with the promise of violence, and Marion's mind raced. The trap had been set, but the question was, would it be enough to stop Robin before he did any more harm? The forest erupted in chaos as the sheriff's men, hidden in the shadows, sprang into action. Arrows whizzed through the trees, and the air was filled with the clash of steel as Robin's gang was ambushed. Robin himself, caught in the middle of the attack, reacted instantly, his movements as fluid and deadly as ever. He parried a sword strike from one of the sheriff's soldiers, before spinning to strike another down with a swift, brutal blow. The sounds of battle echoed through the trees, creating a discordant symphony of death and violence. Robin's men fought back with equal ferocity, but they were outnumbered and quickly overwhelmed by the sheer force of the sheriff's forces. Robin's unparalleled skill was on full display, as he cut down soldiers with lethal precision, his blade flashing in the moonlight. But for every soldier he took down, two more seemed to appear, and slowly, the tide began to turn against him. Little John fought valiantly by Robin's side, but the strain of betrayal weighed heavily on him. He no longer had the heart to fight for the man he had once called a brother. His sword swings lacked the force they once had, and more than once, he found himself glancing nervously over his shoulder, unsure of whether Robin might turn on him at any moment. The bond between them had shattered, and Little John's mind was clouded with the realization of how far they had fallen. In the midst of the battle, Marion made her move. Her heart pounded as she dodged the skirmish around her, pushing her way through the chaos. She wasn't a fighter. She had never been trained for such violence, but she had to reach Robin. She had to make him see reason before this madness consumed them both. As she approached him, the fighting seemed to quiet in her mind. The world narrowed to Robin and the blood that stained his hands. He was still an imposing figure, a symbol of rebellion and justice in the eyes of so many. But Marion could see the monster he had become. She could see the darkness that had overtaken him, the shadow that lurked behind his eyes. "Robin!" she called out, her voice trembling with desperation as she moved closer. "Stop, please. This doesn't have to end in bloodshed." Robin's eyes locked onto hers, and for a fleeting moment, something resembling the man she once knew flickered in his gaze. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a cold, unyielding resolve. His chest heaved with heavy breaths, but there was no remorse in his expression, only the simmering rage that had taken hold of him long ago. "This is who I am now, Marion," he growled, his voice low and filled with finality. "I'd rather die than be captured. This is the only way. You should have known." He stepped toward her, his blade still stained with the blood of those who dared to cross him. For a moment, it seemed as if he might reach out to her, but then his resolve hardened once more. "Don't make me do this," he warned, his hand tightening on the hilt of his sword. Marion felt her heart shatter as the realization hit her. There was no saving him. The Robin she had loved was gone, consumed by the bloodlust he had once fought against. The man before her was a killer, and no amount of pleading could change that. The world around them continued to spin out of control, and Marion knew the end was near. There was only one choice left: fight or die. But even as she prepared for what was to come, she couldn't help but mourn the man she had lost. Robin's next words came like a death sentence. "I've made my choice. Now you must make yours." As the battle raged on behind him, Robin retreated deeper into the forest, moving like a shadow in the night. The sheriff's men were relentless, but Robin knew the terrain better than anyone. The dense trees, the winding paths, and the hidden ravines were all familiar to him. His sanctuary. He knew how to vanish into the wilderness, how to strike from unseen positions, and he used all of these skills to his advantage as he evaded the pursuit. Behind him, the sheriff's men struggled to keep up, growing frustrated and exhausted. They were trained for battle, but they weren't prepared for Robin's guerrilla tactics. He lured them into traps, using the environment to disorient and disarm them. Branches rigged with wires snapped as they passed, sending men tumbling to the ground. Quick, deadly arrows pierced the night air, taking down any soldier who ventured too far from the group. Robin moved with precision, a deadly force that seemed to be everywhere at once. Yet, despite his cunning, the sheriff's men pressed on. They weren't afraid. They had a mission: capture or kill Robin Hood. In the depths of the forest, the confrontation that had been building for years finally came to a head. Little John, having broken free from his own internal struggle, caught up with Robin. His breath came in heavy bursts as he stepped into the clearing, his massive frame blocking Robin's escape. Robin's eyes widened, but he didn't hesitate. The two former allies faced each other, the bitter taste of betrayal hanging in the air. Robin's once confident demeanor was replaced with a quiet intensity, his eyes filled with a mix of anger and regret. Little John stood tall, his sword drawn, but his heart weighed heavy. He had spent years following Robin, fighting beside him, but no more. The man who had once stood for justice was gone, replaced by a murderer. "You've gone too far, Robin," Little John said, his voice low and filled with pain. "Stop this madness. You don't have to die for this." Robin's expression hardened. The man he once was slipping further away with every passing moment. "You think I'm the one who's gone too far?" he spat, his voice laced with venom. "You were my brother, Little John. You swore to stand by me, to fight for the cause." He raised his sword, the blade catching the moonlight. "And now, you turn your back on me." Little John's grip tightened on his weapon. "I never turned my back on you, but I can't follow you into the darkness. This isn't the man I fought with." They clashed with the force of two men who had once been brothers in arms, but now were enemies. Steel rang against steel, each blow stronger than the last, as the two of them fought with everything they had. Robin moved like lightning, his attacks swift and brutal, but Little John matched him blow for blow, his strength and size making up for what he lacked in speed. Little John tried to reason with him, his voice breaking through the chaos of their fight. "Robin, please. You're not this monster." But Robin was too far gone, his eyes burning with a madness that Little John could not quench. With a roar, Robin disarmed Little John, knocking him to the ground. He stood over him, breathing heavily, sword raised high. "Goodbye, old friend," Robin whispered, his voice cold. But instead of striking the killing blow, Robin paused. The weight of his actions seemed to finally dawn on him. A flash of the man he used to be flickered across his face. "You were my brother," Robin said, his voice breaking for the first time in years. "And I can't take that from you." With a final glance at Little John, Robin lowered his sword and stepped back. He had spared him, but it was a hollow victory. Robin wasn't the man who could ever return to what he once was. He had made his choices, and now, there was no turning back. Little John, stunned and breathless, watched as Robin disappeared into the darkness, knowing that the fight wasn't over. Robin's last stand was not against the sheriff or his men. It was against himself. The moonlight barely filtered through the thick canopy of trees, casting long shadows over the forest floor. Robin Hood, bloodied and bruised from his flight through the woods, found himself trapped at the edge of a cliff. The swirling winds of the forest carried the faint scent of damp earth and pine, but the air felt heavy, thick with the weight of the final confrontation. Ahead of him stood the sheriff, his sword drawn and gleaming, and beside him was Marian, her eyes filled with sorrow and determination. Robin's breath came in ragged gasps, but he refused to back down. His face was set in a grimace of defiance, every inch of him screaming that he would not surrender, no matter the cost. "This is it, Robin," the sheriff said, his voice low but resolute. "You've led a life of bloodshed, and it ends here. Surrender." Robin's eyes flicked toward Marian, who took a step forward, her face torn between love and the need for justice. "Please, Robin," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "It doesn't have to be this way. We can end the violence. You don't have to keep running." Robin's gaze hardened. "This is who I am," he growled, his words cutting through the night like a blade. "A thief, a murderer, a leader of men. I've chosen my path, and I'll see it through to the end." Before anyone could react, he lunged forward, his sword flashing through the air. The sheriff parried the blow with ease, his own blade moving with the practiced precision of a man who had spent years in battle. The two clashed, the sound of steel on steel ringing through the night as they circled each other, each waiting for the other to make a mistake. Robin fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal, his movements swift and unpredictable. The sheriff matched him blow for blow, but it was clear that Robin was weakening. His wounds from the earlier skirmishes had taken their toll, and his strength was beginning to falter. Marian watched from the sidelines, torn between her love for Robin and her loyalty to the law. She couldn't bring herself to stop the fight, but every strike between them felt like a betrayal. She had seen Robin at his best, and now, she saw him at his worst, unrecognizable, consumed by the darkness that had overtaken him. The battle reached its climax as Robin, breathing heavily, made one final desperate lunge. But the sheriff was prepared. With a swift and precise movement, he knocked Robin's sword from his hand, sending it flying off the cliff's edge. Robin stood there for a moment, stunned, before he collapsed to his knees, his chest heaving with exhaustion and pain. The sheriff stepped forward, his blade raised. Marian stepped in front of him, her hand outstretched. "No," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Don't do it." Robin's eyes met hers, and for a moment, it was as if the man she had once loved had returned. But the hardness returned just as quickly, and he whispered, "I'm beyond saving, Marian. You know that." The sheriff hesitated, his sword still poised. Marian looked from one man to the other, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision she would have to make. "Please, end this," she said softly, not just for Robin's sake, but for her own, for the village, for the future that could never come with him still alive. With a solemn nod, the sheriff raised his sword and lowered it to the ground, a sign that the battle was over. Robin's reign of terror had come to an end, but even as Robin knelt there, defeated and vulnerable, his eyes never left Marian's. He had known the consequences of his actions, and yet, in his final moments, he was still searching for something, a redemption that would never come. The wind howled through the trees as Robin Hood, bloodied and broken, stood at the edge of the cliff. Below him, the dark abyss yawned, the forest stretching far into the distance like an endless sea of shadows. He had fought, bled, and killed for his cause, but now, with the sheriff's sword raised and Marian's pleading eyes upon him, there was no escape. His chest heaved with ragged breaths as he glanced back at Marian, his former love, his betrayal. The rage, the violence, the bloodshed. It had all led to this moment. There was no redemption for him, no way out from the life he had chosen. He had fallen too far, and now the consequences were unavoidable. With a final, sorrowful glance toward the village that had once embraced him, Robin turned his eyes to the sheer drop ahead. His mind raced for a fleeting moment, but then, in a final act of defiance, he leaped off the cliff. "No!" Marian screamed, her voice raw with desperation. She rushed forward, her hands reaching out as if she could somehow stop the inevitable fall. But the wind swept him away, his figure vanishing into the abyss. The forest below swallowed him whole, leaving nothing behind but silence. The sheriff stood still, watching the empty space where Robin had once stood. His face was grim, filled with a mix of sorrow and resolve. There would be no hero's death for Robin Hood. There would be no peaceful resolution. There would only be the quiet end of a man who had been both a symbol of rebellion and a monster in disguise. The next day, the villagers gathered at the foot of the forest, their expressions a mixture of grief and confusion. News of Robin's death spread quickly, but so did the rumors. Was he a hero? A villain? A savior of the poor? Or a murderer in disguise? The lines blurred as they mourned his death, each person carrying a different memory of the man who had once been their champion. Some whispered that Robin had been their protector, the one who had fought against the injustices they suffered. Others couldn't forget the bloodshed, the lives taken in the name of rebellion. The debate raged quietly among the townsfolk, but it was clear that the legacy of Robin Hood would never be easy to define. As the village mourned, Marian stood by the sheriff, her eyes distant, as if searching for something she couldn't find. "He could have been so much more," she said quietly, her voice heavy with sorrow. Her gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the sun was setting, casting a golden light over the now peaceful forest. The sheriff didn't reply, his face hard with the weight of his own thoughts. There was no satisfaction in Robin's defeat, no sense of victory, only the knowledge that justice had been done, at a terrible cost. As the days passed, the village slowly began to rebuild. The people, though scarred by Robin's reign, found themselves yearning for change. And in the midst of that longing, a new leader emerged. A young man, once a humble peasant, now stood at the forefront of a movement for change. Inspired by Robin's fight for justice, but determined to do things differently, he rallied the poor, vowing to lead them not with violence, but with compassion and fairness. The camera panned over Sherwood Forest, now quiet and serene. The sounds of battle had faded, replaced by the gentle rustle of leaves in the breeze. For the first time in years, the forest seemed at peace. The shadows that had once loomed over the village were no longer a threat, but there was an undeniable sense that Robin's legacy would never truly fade. The struggle for justice would continue, but this time, it would be different. As the screen faded to black, a final thought lingered in the air. A question of what could have been, and what would come next for those who followed in Robin's footsteps.